Hello, everybody. Welcome to your 2022 astrological forecast. My name is Blaze, and I am joined by Liam Sofias. And today we're going to be recording an overview of the major astrological alignments for the year ahead. The structure of this forecast is pretty much going to start off with like the first 30 minutes, just reviewing what each planet is going to be doing as an overview for the year. And then we're going to be going into a breakdown of each of this year, quarter by quarter, spending around 30 minutes on each quarter or around like 10 minutes for each month of the year. So welcome, Liam. I'm excited to do this with you.
Hi, I'm also very excited. We've been working on this slideshow for quite a while, and I'm quite excited to get into it.
Yeah, we've been working on it for like a whole like month at this point now.
Yeah.
So let's get into it. So we're going to be going over something, I guess, what we're calling like our planetary profiles, where we're getting a glance at each planet's activity for the year. So we're going to start with Saturn and taking a look at what Saturn's going to be doing for this year of 2022. Thank you, Liam, for like also creating like this beautiful graphic here of Saturn. And
because Saturn's a very slow planet, he's not going to be leaving Aquarius anytime soon, but we do have him starting at 11 degrees and going all the way up to 25 degrees. And so those degrees of fixed signs are going to feel the harsh influence of Saturn, but we also have him going retrograde. So if you have anything between 18 degrees and 22 degrees, you'll actually get 3 exact hits of Saturn. And so that's going to be something that's going to play out throughout the course of the entire year because he's a very slow moving planet. We have that first station at June and the second station in October.
Yeah, and I think that Saturn is like very interesting this year because it's not going to be moving like to the, I mean, it'll be in a square with Uranus this year, but it's not going to be as exact, but I'm pretty sure it gets like within a degree of each other for the year. So it's still a very similar Saturn Uranus thing, but Saturn is no longer like Saturn can now move past Uranus during this time period. So while we're still getting this idea of like disruption with infrastructure with Saturn Uranus, it's going to be a little bit less, I don't want to say it's going to be a little bit less severe than 2021, but it's still the same story playing out in 2022, just with now Jupiter, now Saturn doesn't have the support from Jupiter anymore, pretty much. And I think that's a big defining thing of Saturn this year is that it's, the Grand Conjunction was in Aquarius in December of 2020, and this is going to be the first year that since that conjunction, since Saturn and Jupiter's new cycle, that they're not going to be in the same sign anymore. And so one of the things I've already looked at and I talk about like on Twitter and everything is like the fixed, and even on my newsletter, like the fixed moon transits are just going to be a little bit more rough going into 2022 because there isn't that support from Jupiter anymore, because there's usually a heaviness that comes in with Saturn where it's like very constricting or like binding in some sort of way, and you find yourself like between a rock and a hard place, and then Jupiter's like, okay, I'll pull you out, but now Jupiter is not there to pull you out anymore. And so in some ways the heaviness doesn't get that relief to like the Aquarius part of your chart that it had in 2021. And I think a lot of like Saturn is just going to ask for a lot of foundational work to be done as it's moving through Aquarius, and it covers new territory in the sign that it hasn't covered as well too, because the furthest it got in 2021 was 13 degrees. And so it was 13 degrees. So it's like its new territory is 14 to 25, which like as Liam said, those transits are gonna, if you have planets, especially in the fixed signs, so in Leo, Aquarius, Taurus, or Scorpio, from around like 18 to 22, you'll definitely feel that heaviness of Saturn play out as a longer plot line and story throughout the year. The other thing sorry, you can go.
I was just gonna say the fixed signs really get it this year because we also have the nodes which go into Taurus and Scorpio. And so not only will that mean that we have eclipses in those signs, which will activate a square to Saturn and will be conjoined Uranus, but also that means that Saturn's going to be at the bendings. He's actually going to be at the southernmost bending, which is the lowest position that the moon can reach in the sky. And so it's linked to these foundations, to these roots, to these structures, very Saturnine themes, but that's only going to be further emphasized with this transit. And to me, just like clearing that stuff out, it's going to be like this process of entropy or even decay. Those are very Saturnine qualities that are kind of sweeping through this most base level of society, of class structure, of anything that you can kind of think of, even in your own life, especially when it comes to the fixed signs in your own chart. We see that Saturn is acting as this clearing out where we're actually having to get down to those roots and like actually dispose of what doesn't need to be there anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's the big thing about Saturn's transit this year is that, you know, it was kind of protected from the bendings last year. And it's really interesting because we're recording this on January 5th, 2022, and Jupiter actually just approached the south bending, like I think on the 3rd or whatever. And so we're getting like both of the greater benefic and the greater malefic at the south bendings, and there's a lot of like faith that is like being cleared out, at least for like January, with Jupiter at the south bending. But then for the majority of the year, it's Saturn there, and it's really like a decay. Like I love that word of like entropy or like something like, you know, decaying, because I mean decay is such a Saturnian thing, but it really characterizes a lot of what 2022 is, because that's a thing that's ongoing throughout the entire year.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's going to, Saturn is, you know, a malefic, so it's going to be bringing things to that extreme of cold and constriction. But let's take a look at Jupiter. Does that sound good with you?
Sounds great.
Perfect. So with Jupiter's motions, Jupiter entered Pisces on December 28th, 2021. So at the very end of last year, Jupiter made its dip back into Pisces. And this isn't the first time Jupiter has come into Pisces. If you think about what happened earlier in 2021, from May 13th to July 28th, that was a little bit of a preview of what you can expect for this new Jupiter and Pisces transit coming into 2022 to be about, because Jupiter is going to make a full run through Pisces this year, and not even just a full run through Pisces. It's going to dip into Aries as well this year. So we're getting this similar sort of thing that happened in 2021, where Jupiter's dipping its toe in a sign and then dipping its toe back out. But it's less like a little bit of a toe dip this year, and it's more so like Jupiter spending half the year in Pisces, half the year in Aries. And so from January to May is going to be Jupiter in Pisces. Jupiter will enter shadow towards the end of its transit through Pisces on May 4th at 28 degrees of Pisces. And then on May 10th, 2022, Jupiter is then going to enter Aries. And then on May 10th up until July 28th, Jupiter is going to be in Aries, fully ingress. And then July 28th is when it's going to station retrograde. And then until October 28th, that's when we'll have Jupiter retrograde in Aries. October 28th, Jupiter will go back into Pisces up until its station on November 23rd, where it'll station again at 28 Pisces, where it was earlier at May 4th, earlier in the year. And then from November 23rd until December 20th, Jupiter is going to move back into Aries, and then it'll eventually leave its shadow in its retrograde period that it started on May, and that full Jupiter shadow will be over by Valentine's Day of 2023. So yeah, Jupiter covers a lot of territory this year, and I think it's definitely Jupiter's homecoming year, but Jupiter has a lot to deal with this year. What are your thoughts on Jupiter this year, Liam?
Well, I think it's really nice that we have the speed that Jupiter is going to have, because when we had Jupiter in Pisces last time, while it was really nice, Jupiter's speed was extremely slow, and he actually, only dipped into Pisces and then immediately retrograded out. And so what we see here is very different, because Jupiter not only has the resources by being in Pisces, but actually has the ability or functionality by being fast in motion. However, that does mean that we get a lot less of a window of Jupiter in Pisces. So there's pros and cons to that. It's the quality versus quantity. We get a smaller quantity, but maybe a higher quality of Jupiter this year. Except then he will also have to battle a few other transits, like Mars being in a sign, and that's going to be something that we're going to have that actually diminishes some of the strength of Jupiter. One of the most notable things that I'm looking at for Jupiter is when his cycle is reborn, and that's going to be on the Aries ingress, because Jupiter will be now leaving the beams of the sun on that date. And that's going to be like a very important moment where we see that Jupiter, it says commits phasis, or becomes apparent, or appears in the sky. And that's going to be a really huge dynamic shift, where we see that Jupiter is not only fast in motion, but he's also going to be in the proper position relative to the sun.
Yeah, and I think that's a big characteristic that I've been like talking about on Twitter with Jupiter is that it's very different than May through July of 2021. Like it's still the same story. Like if we even if we look at, I think it's so crazy the way it's like played out with COVID, especially
Yeah.
because it's like in May 13th, you know, CDC is like you don't have to wear masks, but then then you know there's this restriction that comes in once Jupiter came back into Aries on July 28th. Not Aries, came back into Aquarius on July 28th of 2021. And then, you know, you know, my original prediction of like, okay, when are we going to have some loosening or like better times for just like this pandemic? And my original thought earlier in the year was when Jupiter goes into Pisces, the pandemic is like kind of quote unquote over. But my stance on that has recently changed because I'm like, oh yeah, Jupiter is kind of in the process of ending its cycle in relationship to the sun this time in Pisces, whereas, you know, Jupiter was getting a lot more hotter and was very wet previously, so it was abundant. But this time Jupiter, like you said, doesn't have much to offer because Jupiter is ending its cycle really up until March. And I think that window, even in April, even though April, we'll talk about April, we'll talk about April, even though April is an interesting month, I think we do get to enjoy a lot of Jupiter's qualities then. And I think the difference between Jupiter this year that I think is very interesting is that Jupiter spends a lot of time being wet in Pisces. And, you know, it's in a wet sign, but then Jupiter gets really fiery and really hot when it comes into Aries because its relationship to the sun is going to be, you know, it'll trine the sun and be in its hot and wet phase. But then it's also going to be in a hot and dry sign, or no, it's going to get hot and it'll get eventually drier. But yeah, it'll be a hot and dry sign, and this is the hot and wet Jupiter as a planet. So I think Jupiter's motions, like the expansiveness of Jupiter that we ultimately get, really comes when Jupiter goes into Aries. And I think a lot of what I've interpreted Jupiter and Pisces being about this year is just trying to like, I think especially the Pisces and Aries axis, or not axis, but like these signs see a lot with identity. But there's the pursuit of inner truth with Jupiter and Pisces, and then the like putting that into motion after like soul searching. It's like, okay, now time to expand you and literally expand what you can reach with Jupiter is when Jupiter goes into Aries. So it's going to be a very interesting, Jupiter has a lot of support. And I know like we've talked about this as like we prepared for this, that when like Abu Mashar says that Jupiter is even stronger in Aries than it is in Pisces. So I'm really interested to see if that's even like, I don't want to say true, but I'm interested to see like what the difference is with Jupiter being in a home sign versus it being allegedly in a sign that's even stronger than that.
Definitely. And we see that there's two different things that we can measure Jupiter's strength by. We can look at it by dignity, which is very strong in Pisces, but we can also look at it in terms of sect. And so a more diurnal sign like Aries is actually going to be a little bit more conducive to the sect affiliation of Jupiter, which is a diurnal planet. And then when we look at something like solar phase, it's considered more diurnal to be oriental or eastern relative to the sun. And so what we're seeing is actually a few different incremental steps where Jupiter is currently in a nocturnal phase, in a nocturnal sign, and it has a lot of dignity, has a lot of resources, but it won't actually align with its own sect affiliation until later in the year when it's in Aries and it's oriental. And that actually does produce a little bit more strength that we wouldn't necessarily see with Jupiter and Pisces.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting too, because it's like Jupiter is more so expanding the self inwards and trying to find what it likes. And then Jupiter's like, okay, let's go get it. Like let's go put that into motion. And I'm very excited for Jupiter and Aries in the year. Because I think, but one of the things I was thinking about that was really interesting at the end of the year is that Jupiter actually, even though it spends the first I think 5 months of 2022 in Aries, it'll spend around like January through May in Pisces, but then it takes another dip at the end of the year through Pisces again on October 28th. And I think of this as like Jupiter gets like really dried out, very hot, especially when the opposition happens. I think it'll be during Libra season. And then Jupiter's like, okay, I need to moisturize. I need some water. Like I need to quench my thirst again. It's like there's something that like expands and like gets overheated in a way. And then we're like, okay, we need to cool down after that. And so Jupiter is going to be going through some interesting hot and cold stuff throughout the year.
100%. And, we do see that Mars is going to conjoin Jupiter in Aries later in the year. And so that is going to add a lot of heat and so we do
Wow.
have a lot of transits that will come and support that and then take that away, and Jupiter kind of responds to his environment.
Exactly.
Should we look at Mars?
Yeah. Speaking of Mars, should we move on
Speaking
to
of Mars,
Mars?
yeah.
Let's go. So I'll let you take this one.
Okay, cool. So Mars is going to actually travel quite a lot across the entire zodiac because he is more inferior to our greater planets, the Jupiter and Saturn. So what we see is he actually starts at 13 degrees of Sagittarius on January 1st. And it's going to move all the way around to Gemini. And so what we see is he actually enters his shadow at September 3rd at 8 degrees of Gemini. What's kind of notable is I think it's 9 degrees of Gemini is where Mars is located in the USA Sibley chart. And so we do see it keys into that quite a lot. And we do see that that's going to get hit a few more times. But we then see that Mars is going to station retrograde on October 30th at 25 degrees of Gemini. And then he's going to be moving backwards until actually the end of the year. But it'll be in 2023, January 12th, that he will station direct, and then we'll actually leave the shadow in March 2023 at 25 degrees Gemini. So we actually get Mars in Gemini from it was until like August all the way until next year. And so this is quite a lot of Mars in Gemini, which is going to then characterize the entire half of the second half of 2022. So once we get Mars in Gemini, it stays in Gemini, and that's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah, because in August is when Mars enters on the 20th, and it's August to March. It's 8 months of Mars in Gemini, and it's really interesting because Mars is covering a lot of territory this year that it hasn't covered in a while. Because this is the first time Mars is returning to this half of the zodiac since the beginning of the pandemic, since 2020, and Mars makes a conjunction with Saturn in Aquarius, and it's very different this year than. This is actually the first time Mars is going to conjoin Saturn since its conjunction on March 31st, 2020, which literally coincided with all the lockdowns, at least in the US, where the world was officially like Saturn officially restrained Mars during that time period. And there was a lot of imagery of not being able to do something or having will being restricted. And so it's interesting we start off the year with Mars and Sag, because we start in one we start in the mutable sign and then we end in the opposite one. But then Mars is going to move into its exaltation. It's going to be involved with some besiegement of Venus and kind of maltreating Venus in Aquarius. It'll be the ruler of an eclipse while it's in Pisces. It's be the first time it's visiting Aries since it's retrograde there in 2020. And then it's going to find a lot of battles in Tauruses and then it's going to be eventually retrograding in Gemini. So Mars takes quite a lot of Mars is very active this year, because I think one of the important things as a distinction from 2021 is that Mars was pretty much an evening star throughout most of 2021, but now Mars is changing to be only visible in the morning now. And I think there's a lot of I think it's very interesting, that imagery of just Mars rising bright and early, ready to cause some ready to make some people mad.
Yeah, definitely. The amount of territory that he covers is, quite phenomenal, because we have had a much slower Mars more recently.
Yeah.
So seeing him actually in Aries when there's not a retrograde is going to be huge. Seeing him in Taurus when he's going to be square Saturn is going to be huge. And so we actually do have quite a lot of involvement of Mars that we'll get more into throughout this video. But we are seeing that Mars actually has a lot higher highs and lower lows. When, in Aries, it's going to be very nice. But then in Taurus, in his debility, square Saturn, conjunct the node, there's going to be a lot of, kind of hardship before he then enters Gemini.
Yeah. And I think it's going to be very interesting in Gemini too, because I think it's Uranus that's at 9 degrees in the Sibley chart, but Mars is at 21 Gemini. So I think it approaches it's full Mars return, at least for the US. And I don't know. I think the Gemini part of people's charts is going to be very lit up this year. And even just, I think it's a big year for the mutables. I think it's a big year like for the fixed signs and the mutable signs, because the mutables are going to have Jupiter in their angles, but then they're also going to have Mars in their angles for another half of the month. So half of the year. So one half of the year for at least mutables is going to be really like Jupiter Pisces kind of soul searching vibes, and then the other is going to be Mars, very confused, like almost kind of like fighting itself. I feel like Mars and Gemini, I've noticed in transit it does bring like anxiety, but I was like, if you look at like the tarot cards, for example, it's the 8 of Swords, 9 of Swords, 10 of Swords, at least with the decans. And I think there's going to be a lot of like going back and forth or having to confront like specific truths. And I think it's really a battle of like truth and information, especially when the opposition comes up in Sag season.
Definitely. Should we look at then our next planet?
Yes, we should definitely go to Venus. Or no, not Venus, the sun. Yeah, so the sun is doing its lap year to year basis, around the zodiac. And the main things that the sun will run into are going to be when it becomes eclipsed on April 30th. The sun will be eclipsed at 10 degrees and 28 minutes of Taurus. And then we run into another solar eclipse at the end of the year on October 25th. Where it becomes eclipsed at 2 degrees of Scorpio. And it's very interesting because this is like going to be our first full year with the North and South node in Taurus and Scorpio, and really changing like the dynamics of this sign and this chart and this part of people's charts. And I think it's going to be a big year for the fixed signs, because they get specifically the Taurus and the Scorpio risings, because the nodes will enter their first and seventh house, and sequentially the eclipses will be in their first and seventh house. But then it's going to be like Saturn's also there too. And I think that a lot of what I think this eclipse series is going to be about is like we're increasing in the Taurus energy of our charts, because the North Node is going to be there, and then we're also working to release a lot of what the Scorpio parts of our charts are. And I think of the North Node in Taurus as like a desire for like nourishment, or a desire for more stability or more security, and trying to find ways where people can have their own livelihood be dependent on like regain autonomy over their own livelihood. And I think with the South Node being in Scorpio, there's a lot of release on like emotional like pain and like trauma. It makes me think of, especially just like with the amount of people like have lost, it's just like either things or people, whatever it is, just the amount of loss there's been throughout the pandemic. I think that having the South Node in Scorpio is working through a lot of like, it's fixed water. So it's like those deep seated like emotions, and specifically relating to pain, because Mars is that ruler. And I don't know, it's in some ways it can get, I think there's going to be a big distinction. What we'll talk about with the moon when it's in Taurus and Scorpio, but having the nodes here as well is very interesting, because we're going to be getting a lot of new beginnings with the solar eclipses happening in these signs. Do you have any thoughts about those eclipses?
Definitely. I think that the nodes there just by themselves are quite notable, especially because we have that square Saturn, and it's going to be quite important. However, I do think that when we actually like hone in on the North Node in Taurus, we can see that the North Node has to speak to like acquisition and gain, because we see that that's where the moon starts to ascend above the sun, where it rises to power. So we see that the North Node has to do with increase and the rise of something. And then we see that that's in Taurus. Taurus being ruled by Venus has to do with the goods of the world, the delights of the world. And so whatever the acquisition of goods is, whether that's a regular 9-to-5 job or other types of jobs or any type of labor, we see that that's all associated with Taurus, because it has to do with the acquisition of goods. And so we see that there's quite a lot of changes happening there. And then in respect to the square to Saturn, we see that the structure is actually becoming depleted, and that there's a stress on the system that's actually going to change how people acquire their goods. And I think that that's quite notable for the year.
Yeah, especially because that like Saturn, even though it's at the south bending, it's overcoming Taurus. And so it's like the Oh my God. It's such a stressful transit to talk about, and I don't want to talk about worst case scenario, but it does look like a lot of this, like the infrastructure of how we like relate to the economy or things that are goods and the value that things even have, has a lot of pressure. And there's a lot of decay around it. And as you said, like entropy, with Saturn, being in that overcoming square. But again, the Saturn, the overcoming square to like Taurus is the fact that it's kind of worthless now.
Mm. Yeah.
No.
I definitely agree. And it doesn't have to be in a worst case scenario, but we
Totally.
do see that there is quite a lot of change and evolution that has to take place in the way that people acquire goods. And then when we actually look at the economic system and we look at how people are buying things and trading things and selling things, we can actually look at Gemini and we see that the Mars retrograde is going to be happening in that sign. And so, we have different angles to look at this same situation where there's going to be a change in how people acquire goods. And then we see that there is going to be a disruption of the way that people trade and the way that the economy is actually operating.
Yeah, totally. So should we move on to Venus now?
Sounds good.
Perfect. So I'll let you take Venus then.
Yeah, so we actually start this year with Venus retrograde that we're currently all experiencing, and that's going to end on January 29th at 11 degrees of Capricorn. And then she's going to be moving forward throughout the rest of the year, and we see that she actually will go all the way around the zodiac and end in Sagittarius. So she'll be hitting every single sign, every single whole sign house. She'll be somewhere during the course of the year. And this is pretty normal because she's actually faster than the sun. So if the sun goes around the zodiac in the course of 1 year, Venus is expected to do about the same. What we do see is that she is going to be besieged in Aquarius. And so this is going to be quite notable as we are very excited that Venus won't be retrograde anymore. She will actually be in this kind of tango with Mars. And so what's interesting is she'll apply to Mars and then Mars will apply to her. And it's this weird mix. Actually, the order's switched where Mars will apply to Venus and then Venus will apply to Mars. But that's going to be a very notable start to our year in terms of Venusian topics, because we have Mars pursuing Venus. This is actually quite rare, only because normally Venus is the faster moving planet. And so the fact that a usually slower planet like Mars is, in this case, faster due to the phase that he's in and the phase that Venus is in, we see that Mars pursues Venus, captures Venus, but then Venus gets away, and then Venus actually comes back. It's this whole back and forth, this kind of dance, this like tango, and then Venus is going to be besieged between Mars and Saturn. And so that's going to be quite a lot to like handle. And it's not all bad, but we do see that there is a moment of stress that's then going to be relieved when Venus actually enters Pisces. And so when she enters Pisces, she's going to be at home in her own exaltation. We have this amount of resources that she gains. She's going to be with Jupiter. So that's a very stark like contrast where we have this like moment of a lot of tension, this like escape from peril. And then we see that she actually finds peace and comfort and all of her needs are met by that transit through Pisces. And then we do have other events where she's in Aries, which is not as, comfortable for her as she's in Pisces. And then she actually gets more comfortable in Taurus. However, she actually has to square off against Saturn. So we'll definitely be talking about that aspect because she'll also be conjoined to the North Node. And so there's a lot of power dynamics where Saturn is actually going to be superior in his position, but Venus has a lot of dignity and is also conjoined the North Node. And so that square is going to be very prominent and very important. But then we actually will see that Venus, as she goes around the zodiac, will definitely meet some more challenging points, especially when she gets into Virgo, which is naturally her fall. She'll also be ending her relationship of visibility to the sun. And so she'll be setting under the beams while also squaring Mars. And so we actually see that there's some very, very high highs and also some kind of difficult transits that she has to endure throughout the course of the year. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that Venus, like one of the things I was like just paying attention to is just Venus
Mhm.
and the nodal cycle and how they're both
Yeah.
18 months long. And I was like, this is very interesting that Venus's retrogrades are in 18 months intervals. And then
Mhm.
during the Venus retrograde, the nodes change signs on January 18th. So we get this nodal, like we get this nodal change at the beginning of the year in the midst of a Venus retrograde. And then Venus doesn't really get any relief um when it goes into Aquarius, because like you said, there is this besiegement, and I want to leave some of my thoughts for talking about that later. But Venus does have a lot of stress this year, at least up until April, and then
Mhm.
The Venus Jupiter conjunction, sweet
Amazing.
spot in the year, such a sweet spot. And I think the other sweet spot is going to be when Venus does go into Libra as well too, because Venus will be like reborn by the sun then. And I
Yeah.
think it's interesting that like Venus, I was doing some research, like this is the last time, this is the first time since 1771 that we're having a cazimi, an exterior conjunction in Libra with
Ah,
Venus.
yeah.
So it's because the previous exterior conjunctions, like the previous one that was in this part of the zodiac, was on October 25th, 2014, but that
Mhm.
was in Scorpio. But this is the first time it's like changing into Libra. So there's really a different, like Venus is going through a paradigm shift in its much larger cycle of its
Yeah.
like 5-point star that it makes. So I
Mhm.
just thought that was very interesting. And Venus spends this year as a morning star as well too. So that's also notable that both Mars and Venus are morning stars this year. And there's a lot of passion and fire that ignites and brings in like this year, because we have
Mhm.
these planets, coming before the sun. We also have Saturn and Jupiter, who are eventually going to become morning stars, but we get Venus and Mars there for a good majority of the year.
Yeah, definitely. And that phase is very important, especially with Venus, because we actually see a lot of mythology describe Venus as both a god of love, but also a god of war. And some
Mhm.
people that aren't very familiar with Venus will then be like, oh, well, that doesn't make sense. Those are quite opposite.
Yeah.
However, because Venus has two different phases, they're actually quite distinct. And so when she's an evening star, when she's western from the sun, she's actually going to be that goddess of love. And then when
Yeah.
she's oriental or a morning star, we're actually going to see that Venus is more of that god of war. She's more passionate and driven and a little bit more aggressive.
Yeah, totally. Like Venus gets hotter in that phase too. And Venus is going to be, yeah, I don't want to talk too much about Venus yet, because I want to save that for some of the months. So I think we should move on
Okay,
then. But Venus is doing a lot this year. So
sure.
let's move on. So for Mercury, like I love how you did Venus and I'm doing Mercury, and you're
Right.
ruled by Venus, I'm ruled by Mercury. Here we go. So yes,
Quite fitting.
so Mercury, we start off this year with Mercury stationing retrograde on January 14th in Aquarius. And one of the defining features for Mercury's retrogrades this year is that Mercury will be retrograding between the air signs and the earth signs. So Mercury will station retrograde in all of the air signs, but then it'll station direct in all of the earth signs. And we see this change represented by the element change of the North Node, where the North Node, when it enters whatever sign, whatever element the North Node is in, will be the element of the Mercury retrograde. So because the North Node at the beginning of the year will be changing from air in Gemini to Earth in Taurus, we'll see that reflected in the Mercury retrogrades. And then it's interesting because the South Node will show where the exterior conjunctions are. And so in the exterior conjunctions in like 2021, and what'll be a residual in 2022, is we'll have some exterior conjunctions in fire signs, because the South Node was in Sag, but now they're going to be shifting into the water signs, which will be with the South Node being in Scorpio. So we have our first retrograde from January 14th to February 3rd in between Aquarius and Capricorn. And then from May 10th to June 3rd will be our retrograde from Gemini to Taurus. And then our retrograde in Libra through Virgo will be September 9th to October 2nd. And then we're going to get our Kazimis throughout the year. The interior conjunction is going to be on January 23rd. We'll then have our exterior conjunction on April 2nd in Aries. And then on May 21st, we'll have our interior conjunction while Mercury is retrograde at 0 degrees of Gemini. Then July 16th, we'll have our first exterior conjunction in a water sign in Cancer. And then we'll have our interior conjunction while retrograde Mercury at 0 degrees of Libra. And then we'll have our final exterior conjunction for the year happen on November 8th. And it's very interesting because November 8th is also the day we have a lunar eclipse in Taurus. So we will see that in the next slide for the moon be relevant as well. But Mercury does have a lot of territory to cover this year. And it's not going to be strictly like air this year, which might be kind of good because the air retrogrades of 2021 have been very like more like a whirlwind. And I think what's kind of nice about these retrogrades is that Mercury is looking for some grounding and taking these like whatever's in like the mental or communicative air sign and looking to bring it down to earth or down to reality. And I think a lot of the Mercury retrograde like cycle for this year is all again about be taking what's up here in our brains or in our head and trying to actually materialize those things and make them physical in a way, or making like ideas physical. Do you have any like thoughts about Mercury this year, Liam?
Yeah, I always think of Mercury retrograde in a way that John Frawley describes it in some of his books, where he talks about the mythology of Loki and how Loki has to be held back because if he's not, then he causes the end of the world. And so I think about the phase relationship between Mercury and the sun. And so the sun actually has to reign in Mercury when he gets too far away. And so, like you were saying, when our thoughts are like just being completely disconnected from our sun, we have this like idea of, Loki's running rampant and he has to actually be reined in. And so I don't look at Mercury retrogrades as this terrible thing, but rather we're reining in that Mercury, we're bringing it back to basics. We're kind of, grabbing it and saying like, no, don't, cause the end of the world.
Like, no, Mercury, don't.
Right. And Mercury gets, very detail oriented, very anxious, a little bit nervous. And so it's actually nice to kind of pull him back and say, you know what, we want to start from the beginning. Let's start from scratch. Let's make a list of pros and cons. Let's get more practical. And so, throughout all of these retrogrades, you'll be able to note the very stark difference between beginning in an air sign and the end in more of an earth sign.
Oh yeah.
Very useful for sure.
Yeah, I love that imagery of Loki, especially just because my boyfriend and I, we've been talking about like Loki and Marvel lately.
Oh, really?
And I've been like pointing out, like I've been like, I've been saying like that's Mercury. That's like the imagery right there of like Mercury. And I think that's just very interesting. Like, yeah, like, and I know you were talking about that when we were like doing our like prep work for this, that yeah, Mercury is debilitated in Sag because Mercury has all freedom to not cause the end of the world, but like you can't hold Jupiter's not holding Mercury back there.
Yeah, definitely.
So yes, I really love all these thoughts. And I think especially like talking about that November 8th eclipse, this is a good transition into the moon, I think. Do you think we should
definitely
do that?
100%. Yeah, so with the moon, we've already kind of looked at the sun and those eclipses. So this is just going to be the lunar eclipses where we have basically a supercharged full moon. And so we actually have one May 16th, and that's going to be in Scorpio at 25 degrees. And that's going to be exactly opposite basically to the last eclipse that we had. That was in Taurus. And then what we're actually going to be seeing is on November 8th, we have a lunar eclipse in Taurus at 16 degrees. And so this is just the other half of that eclipse coin where we're going to be seeing that activation. And what's most notable is actually, in my opinion, where we see this key into other people's charts, because we actually have the son of Joe Biden actually in that very end of Taurus. And so this is going to be right on top of that. And we actually, when we look at like the Queen of England, she has the ruler of her ascendant at the very end of Taurus too. And so we actually have this kind of like keyed into prominent figures, Joe Biden, the Queen, I'm sure others. And so, seeing how on a mundane level, we're looking at the changes of the acquisition of goods, we're looking at, a change in the system, the structures kind of, rotting away at the base level and having to replace that with something new. And we also see this keyed into very prominent figures that are, in very high places.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too because the North Node in is in Taurus, and so when the moon's getting there, the moon's already increasing in latitude, but she's also in her exaltation too.
Yeah.
So it's like the moon really, and I think this is why we're getting like higher highs and lower lows for this year, especially because the moon is bringing everything to a high. And then like when the moon's in Taurus, you know, especially at the North Node, the moon is chilling. You know what I mean? The moon is good. But then when the moon goes into Scorpio, this is where we run into some issues because the moon is like depressed with the South Node. You know, the moon is definitely having a very uncomfortable time in Taurus. And so I think that one of the things I've been kind of like not struggling to tell like clients, but like I like one of the kind of news I've had to break to like clients is like, look, these Taurus eclipses are nice, but like especially in like in April, May, like the Taurus like April 30th eclipse, great, love it. But then if you ask me about that May 16th lunar eclipse, you're not going to get the same answer.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess that's the moon. The moon is doing a lot this year. As I said earlier, like the fixed signs are gonna, like the moon's transits through the fixed signs are gonna be a lot heavier, but they'll be a lot lighter through the mutable signs, which I think might be nice. And then through the cardinal signs, they'll just be very like action oriented, especially when Jupiter comes into Aries.
Yeah, definitely.
So yes, I guess this is just kind of like what all the planets are going to be doing for the next year. And should we go break down the quarter by quarter now?
Yeah, for sure.
Perfect. Let's get into it. So we start off quarter one, Q1, with January through March. And when we look at January, the title we have come up for this month is going to be called Mirror Month, Part 1, specifically because Mercury is going to be in Aquarius towards the beginning of the month, and then it'll station retrograde and then go to Capricorn towards the end of the month. We're also going to get a Venus Cazimi. So Venus will conjoin and enter the heart of the sun on January 8th, which is actually this Saturday. And then the nodes will enter Taurus and Scorpio. And then we're also going to get both Venus and Mercury simultaneously retrograde throughout this month.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on just an overview of like just some like what this kind of creates for the
when we look at the 2 months, and we've called it mirror month because we actually see such a parallel between January and February. And so when we're looking especially at that Cazimi, we notice January has a Venus Cazimi, and we'll look at February, which has a Saturn Cazimi. And so those are going to be two very different qualities. When we think of the planet Venus, she's considered a very moist planet, one that brings things together, that brings things into harmony. When we talk about the philosophical concept of moisture, I always think about it in regards to like rice, and that sounds weird, but if you have dried rice, it's very easy to pick apart a single grain, but if it has moisture in it, it's actually going to clump together. And so Venus's wet quality is going to bring things together into cohesion, but Saturn is a very dry planet, and so that's great for defining things and for actually looking at one thing separate from the others, but it is going to not be as conducive to bringing things together or growth, and so that can cause or strike some chords of disharmony. And so that's the two kind of sides of the same coin, where we have bringing things together, but then also having to separate them out and define them individually. And that kind of brings us to that January-February crux.
Yeah, and I think that's very important. Like I love that analogy of just rice with Venus, because I think my analogy I usually use is like glue. Like if glue is dried out, you can't really stick anything together. But when you get some nice glue that's like kind of like wet and that's like properly like sealed and everything, then you can actually use it to like bind things together. So it's really interesting that we have both Mercury and Venus throughout the month. There's a lot of revision that's taking place, especially in the Capricorn parts of people's charts. We're going to also see that the eclipse that happened on November 19th in 2021 starts to become more like activated, because the nodes will now start to cross those degrees. Because when the eclipse took place in November, the North and South node were still in Gemini, but we actually get that nodal shift coming in this month now. And to kind of give an overview of the calendar for the month, this calendar was created by me for the years. So I love this calendar, not because I made it. I mean, yes, because I made it, but because one of the things I always want to like get people to be more aware of is like the days of the week in particular. And when these like these planets become activated. Like, for example, on a Sunday, we get like on January 2nd, we had a new moon when the sun was, when it was the sun's day, or we get a full moon on the moon's day in Cancer on the 17th. But to kind of go an overview of this chart, on the first of the month, we get the sun trine Uranus. Then on January 2nd, we have a new moon in Capricorn, but also Mercury entering the sign of Aquarius. And then on the 9th, at least in my time zone, on the 9th, we get this Venus conjoining the sun. Then on the 11th, we get Mars square Neptune. Then on Friday the 14th, Mercury will station retrograde in Aquarius. 2 days after, we get a full moon in Cancer. The next day after that full moon, Uranus stations direct. The North Node enters Taurus. The South Node enters Scorpio. The next day, we get on the 19th, the sun will enter Aquarius. Then on the 23rd, Mercury will conjoin the sun after being reined in starting on the 14th. Then on the 24th, Mars will then enter Capricorn into the sign of its exaltation. Then we're also going to get Mercury re-entering the sign of Capricorn just 2 days after that on the 26th. And then finally, Venus will station direct in Capricorn on Saturday the 29th. And then on Sunday the 30th, the sun will square Uranus. And to kind of showcase our important chart, like we picked out one chart for each month that we think represents what this month is going to look like, and like a pivotal chart that represents like the turning point for the month. And so for January, we picked the Venus Cazimi on the 8th. And what are your thoughts on this Cazimi? Because I think it's actually a kind of like, I think it's definitely a very energizing Cazimi, because we get the moon in like a cardinal sign, but it's also like in Capricorn too, so which is another cardinal sign. But it's definitely, again, like you said, trying to bring something together, or trying to make something like more cohesive, or trying to find like a solution.
Yeah. Well, what I find very interesting and what I like about these charts and how we've displayed them is we always put the sun in the first house. And so why we do that is so you can actually see very clearly what planets are going to be above the sun. Those are going to be morning stars, and all the planets below are going to be evening stars. And so what this kind of moment kind of keys into is the phase change between Venus being an evening star and then being a morning star. And so that shift happens, as well as we see that the sun is going to continue moving and then going to make Saturn reborn and then Jupiter reborn. And so we kind of are keying through all these planets, making them morning stars one at a time. And this is just like the first step into that. And so January we see is the beginning of these phase changes, and we will get one every month basically. And that just shows that we're at the end of this like wintry kind of astrological year, and we're moving into this rebirth. And it's actually very much formally when we have a new year astrologically, when the sun moves into Aries, that we have then Jupiter finally reborn, and all these planets have undergone their phase changes.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an important part of just like the even January in general, because we're like, again, going, like you said, going through them one by one. And I think with Venus, a lot of that has been around like socialization. Like I know, like I was talking to some of my friends who live in New York because they were going to come down to where I'm at in Florida for their like college break for like the holidays, but they ended up canceling their flights, because the way it is in like New York, especially like with the lockdowns, is the same way it was at the beginning of the pandemic. There's lines around the blocks everywhere just to get into grocery stores, to get testing and everything. And that it's getting like the idea of like Venus's socialization being or the idea of socialization being like thwarted because of like a pandemic. It makes me think of what we're also dealing with throughout January is Mars square Jupiter, because even though they're not like applying to an aspect with each other, they're still in that whole sign relationship to each other, where Mars is spreading something, and Jupiter, it's not something we necessarily want to be spread, because Jupiter is in this phase that is very cold and will eventually get drier as we go into like February, especially in February, because I think it's February 18th that Jupiter sets under the beams. But then I think we also get Saturn setting under the beams in January too. So in many ways, there's a lot of stuff that is ending and a lot of stuff that is decaying throughout like the winter. Like the winter is this like the seasons, whether you're in the whether you're in the southern hemisphere or the northern hemisphere, the idea of winter is something decaying, or like the leaves falling off the trees or whatever. And that's really what we get a lot through January. And again, this is majority happening in the Capricorn part of our chart, at least for January, because again, Mercury, a Capricorn Aquarius, really Aquarius for Mercury, but Mars then comes to bring in at the end of the month some added passion and fire and a little bit more direction, I think, as well, because I think Mars and Sag, like Mars is an immutable sign here, and I think Mars in the mutable signs can be like inconsistency in the direction of taking something. But I think Mars in going into Capricorn will start to, it's like Mars is starting to make its climb up the mountain that the goat will sit up upon.
Definitely. Should we move on to February?
Yeah, let's move on to February. So I guess I'll let you take the lead with February, and we'll do an alternate.
Sounds good. When we come to February, we see that, kind of like I already mentioned, Saturn is going to be Cazimi, and that's going to be very notable. Now, Venus and Mercury are going to be slow in motion. However, they're going to be regaining their speed. So that's going to be very nice, as we had this double retrograde in January, and now we're actually moving forward and actually like picking up some speed. And so as we move from trying to get things to come together, we're actually now having that newfound direction. We're having that newfound ability to define something in its isolation, and then picking up speed when we look at that.
Yes, totally. When we go into the month, February, I don't want to say February is calmer, but it is definitely, it's probably the calmest month we have in the year. Would you say that's an accurate statement, or?
Yeah, it's pretty calm compared to everything else in the year.
Everything else.
Yeah.
Yeah. So at the first of the month, we start with the new moon in Aquarius. And then on the third of the month, Mercury will station direct. Finally, on Friday, we get the Saturn. It'll be Friday, at least in my time zone. It might be Thursday from some other people. But it'll be the Saturn Cazimi. So Saturn will conjoin the sun and start its new cycle and change, to eventually become a morning star. It's also the same day that Mars will sextile Jupiter too. And so it'll be like the final ending of their cycle since their conjunction, which took place, I think, in January of 2020. So it'll be the ending of their cycle together. Then when we move into next week, we get Mercury conjoining Pluto for the final time. Then on Saturday, we get Mars trine Uranus. Back next on February 14th, on Valentine's Day, we get Mercury re-entering Aquarius, which will be kind of reminiscent of the beginning of the year when Mercury entered Aquarius on the 2nd. And then on the 16th, we get a full moon in Leo. And on top of that full moon in Leo, that's the same day that Mars conjoins Venus. Yeah. And I'm gonna have to fix this in the calendar, but I think it's very interesting that Mars and Venus are playing tag essentially throughout February and March, because Mars is like, okay, you're at Venus, and then Venus is like, I'm it, okay, I'm gonna come, I'm like, Venus is gonna go towards Mars, and I don't want to say get revenge, but like Venus is like picking up a lot of speed. Like Venus is wasting no time. It's interesting because the next day after, Jupiter is making a sextile to Uranus. And then we also get the sun entering Pisces on Friday the 18th. And then our final, I guess, major aspect for the month would be on that following Friday, where Mercury will square Uranus. And that kind of takes us to the end of the month.
Yeah, which one thing I would definitely emphasize is that Venus conjunct Mars, because when we look at the last time that happened, it was going to be, I think, July of 2021. Yeah. And so what we're seeing with this is they actually had a very interesting relationship when they were in sextile to each other, because they never actually perfected that aspect. Mm-hmm. They got very, very close, and that could have felt like something was about to go through, but it fell through at the last minute, or we were about to see something come together and it didn't. That kind of feeling is very frustrating, because it was really looking like something could have happened and it didn't. And now that we're actually coming to their conjunction, that's when we might see something finally come together. When we look at that cohesiveness that was brought about by the Venus Cazimi in January, this might be when we actually feel like we can put it to work,
Yeah. And I think that's something I've been predicting for my clients a lot too, like especially back in November when that sextile was forming. It's like Venus and Mars. It's like feeling like edged in a way. Like you're like it's like being hyped up, but then realizing like, oh wait, like shit, like there's no hype anymore.
Yeah.
But then the hype rebuilds again, and I think this day, the day that Venus conjoins Mars on a full moon on a Regulus too, it's definitely going to be a passion. It's gonna be especially because it's around the same time as Valentine's Day. It's gonna be a Valentine's Day filled with passion,
Yeah.
and a lot of heat. And I think it's interesting that maybe what was building before with like that sextile when Mars was in Scorpio and Venus in Capricorn, there's like, Mars was in its home sign, but Mars like had challenges that it had to like push through and work through. But now Mars is in its exaltation. And so Mars really can be a lot more constructive to work with and actually like, get stuff done and get shit done. Which I think will be nice. Like we are able to break out of stagnation through just a lot of the cardinal Earth that takes place.
Yeah, and I think when the moon actually comes to conjoin them around February 14th, so
Mhm.
it's just before, that can also be a
Yeah,
very notable moment. And so we see that week is very much categorized by their conjunction.
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's take a look at our chart of the month. So it looks like for the chart of the month, we've picked the Saturn Kazemi,
Mhm.
and Saturn's being reborn, and there is like an opportunity to like build like a new foundation or like make a new commitment. And I think this might be really good for Saturn because Saturn will like start to be more constructive and less dangerous of like structure collapsing. But it's also really interesting too because it looks like Saturn has to create some sort of new structure because it's about to approach the bendings. And the bendings are getting closer to Saturn actually because they move faster than Saturn. So it's almost like something new is needing to be formed as a result of realizing like what is obsolete is kind of phasing out or decaying. Like I'm thinking of something like being obsolete or going out of fashion with Saturn,
Mhm.
especially like in January, and then needing to like replace that. Like, okay, what's the like replacement for this structure or for this
Yeah.
stability that we're looking for?
Yeah.
And there might be a little bit of stagnation and delay that does come in, especially at the beginning of the month because things are very slow. But then things start to speed up, especially as Mars gets to Venus.
Definitely. I think that is an important piece, especially when we look at what was traditionally considered the most dangerous phase for Saturn was
Yeah.
actually right before the Cazimi. So that's going to be when it's a very cold and wet phase. And so that cold actually just exacerbates the already cold nature of Saturn.
Yeah.
And this is when we start to move away from that. And so this is actually approaching those Saturn ruled topics of your life in a new light that's a lot less abrasive, moving forward.
Yeah, and I think this might have a lot to do, like especially like with the lockdowns that are happening out, like happening, like there might be a like heavy force of like restriction potentially that becomes imposed with the coldness of Saturn being exacerbated, and
Yeah,
then we start to see that alleviate a little bit as we come out of February.
definitely.
So yeah, let's move on to should we move on to March?
Yeah.
Perfect. So March's phrase is out with the old, in with the new.
Uh,
We get Jupiter Kazemi, but we have Venus becomes besieged by the malefics this March, and essentially what that just means is that the malefics are Mars and Saturn. So Mars is the lesser malefic, and it's the principle of extreme heat, whereas Saturn is the greater malefic, and it's the principle of extreme cold. And when a planet is besieged, it is coming in between these two malefic planets, and it's almost kind of seen like being stuck in between a rock or a hard place, or being like trapped or in an uncomfortable situation. And it's interesting because this month as well, Mercury will go into the beams of the sun, and Jupiter will be exiting the beams of the sun as well too. So it's almost like Mercury, after its retrograde cycle, is now coming back for an exterior conjunction to conjoin with the sun, and Jupiter's finally being, committing phases and being visible during the morning. So we actually get a Jupiter through part of March. Well, really kind of February is really when we see Jupiter going under the beams. And then we get Jupiter under the beams, and then Jupiter emerges from the beams in March.
yeah.
And this brings us, March is a pretty dynamic month, honestly.
Mhm.
We get Mercury and Saturn conjoining on the 2nd, on the same day as the new moon. which is interesting because Mercury and Saturn in January wanted to conjoin with each other, or at least Mercury did. Mercury was like approaching Saturn, and I kind of interpreted like January's Mercury Saturn co-presence as like Mercury is like it's almost kind of like coming to a gate and asking like the person guarding that gate, like, hey, can I come in? And Saturn's like, no.
Yeah.
Like, no, you can't. And then Mercury's like, okay, I'm going to go retrograde and find and like, be reined back in. And then Mercury kind of approaches Saturn again. And Mercury's like, can I come in? And then Saturn's like, okay, yes, this time, because Mercury will actually pass Saturn after that conjunction. And it's a new moon too. And it's very interesting because the following day after, we get both Mars and Venus, who are moving at roughly the same pace through the zodiac, conjoin Pluto. On the 5th is when we get Jupiter becoming reborn by the sun in a Cazimi. And then on the 6th, we get Mars enters Aquarius first. Then Venus will enter Aquarius, and then Venus will conjoin Mars and tag Mars back after February. Then when we move onto March 10th, Mercury will then enter Pisces. And then on the 13th, we get a Neptune Cazimi, where Neptune becomes reborn by the sun. And then on the 18th, we get a full moon in Virgo. On the 19th, Venus will square Uranus. The 20th is when we get the Aries ingress. The 21st is when we get Mercury conjoined Jupiter in Pisces. We get Mars square Uranus on the 22nd from Aquarius to Taurus. And then we get Mercury conjoined Neptune on the 23rd. And then finally in the month, we get Mercury entering Aries, and then Venus conjoins Saturn. And then on the 28th, when Venus conjoins Saturn, that'll be when she leaves her besiegement. So she starts her besiegement on the 6th and then ends it on the 28th.
Yeah. So this month definitely has what we see is both of the benefic planets, Venus and Jupiter, actually quite afflicted. And so that is going to be quite challenging. When it comes to Venus, it's because of that besiegement being between a rock and a hard place. It's like what we're coming from was bad and what we're going to is bad. And then we see that she breaks free at the end. And so, this could represent a moment of extreme lockdowns or some type of measures going in that actually put a strain on Venusian type qualities of delight and pleasure or goods or, freedom and justice even. And so then what we see is, what is this for? It's for Venus to actually go into Pisces and have her exaltation. When it comes to Jupiter, on the other hand, we see that the phase relationship with the sun, while he is reborn, we also see that Jupiter is not going to be visible until around the end of the month, around the 20th, 21st. Yeah. And so what that means is that when Jupiter, this planet that represents freedom, but also truth, is going to be obscured. And so when it comes to like conspiracy theories or like cult followings, unfortunately, that might be a time when we see a lot of increase of that, because Jupiter, this star of truth and like understanding, that's actually going to be obscured from our visibility. And it's going to be in Pisces. So Jupiter really wants to find the truth. Jupiter really wants to find what's really going on, but it might not be able to properly when it's actually obscured by the sun.
There's an element of gullibility that comes in with especially like Mercury in Pisces. And it's something I've noticed is like just kind of like not questioning something or not believing or not like questioning any sort of belief or faith. Whereas Mercury, Mercury can destroy the world in a way, because Mercury can make you completely change your perspective of what's real and what's, not real. And so I think it's very interesting that we have that. One of the ways I was thinking about the besiegement, I feel like there's two ways you can look at it, where you can look at Venus being trapped, or you can look at it as Venus, because like there's the besiegement that happens between Venus and
translation of light.
Not the translation of light, but it's what's it called? It's because the thing is Mars enters Aquarius first. The Mars-Saturn conjunction will be building, but then Venus is cutting off the light from Mars reaching Saturn. And so there's some sort of interference that's coming in where Venus is, Mars is, wants to do something and it's getting hit with a no from Saturn. And Venus is, Mars is kind of angry, but Venus is like in between extreme heat and extreme cold. And what better person to keep the balance? And it almost looks like a third party having to keep two like different parties in check who are like feuding with each other. But on the 28th, Venus is like, I'm done with this shit. Like, this is not my responsibility. And Venus, leaves that besiegement, or maybe there's some maybe Venus realizes that Venus cannot restore balance in this way. Or I don't want to say Venus is like kind of giving up, but by the time Venus conjoins Saturn, Mars wouldn't have conjoined Saturn. So Mars finally has its path clear to get to Saturn.
Yeah. And, I really like to think about the correspondence between planets and cars, just a personal hobby of mine. But when we look at something like Mars, which is going to represent heat, and we look at something like Saturn, which can be coal or any type of fuel, something like oil, what we're looking at is this very combustive combination. When we look at Venus, that's actually going to cool things down and make things a lot more temperate. So like you said, it is actually nice to have her kind of stepping in, even though she's going to then take a lot of the burden of being trapped. So, it's a little bit sacrificial, and we have this savior Venus, this goddess of war, like, no, we won't put up with this anymore. And that I think is very useful. And then when you talked about Mercury and that information, I definitely think that's going to be an important piece where media online or anything is going to be very much gullible, and maybe misinformation is going to be spread because, when we look at, I practice horary a lot, and when we look at something like Mercury in Pisces, if somebody were to ask if a letter was truthful, or if, somebody told them the right information, if we saw Mercury in Pisces, that would be a testimony towards, no, it's not truthful, or, we're not getting the whole story here, or it might have partial truths. When we think of the mutable sign or double-bodied sign, we can think of partial truths. And so, people might be saying something that's true, but then, throwing in a lot that's not. And that can be something that we have to be wary of.
The image that's coming to my mind, or like the scene that's coming from my mind, is from SpongeBob, where Patrick and SpongeBob are working to sell chocolate bars, and they're like, we're not lying, we're stretching the truth. And I'm like, that is totally what Mercury and Jupiter are doing in March, is they're stretching the truth.
For sure.
Yeah. Oh my God, that episode is too funny. It just popped into my mind, and I was like, oh my God, this is like too funny. So yeah, there is a lot of sacrifice. There's a lot of uncomfortability that comes into March. Even though Jupiter does become reborn, we find like when Jupiter commits phases by I think it's by the 21st, you'll actually see Mercury. It's interesting because Jupiter commits phases, and so does Mercury, like at the same time, where Mercury is like entering into the beams. And it's like, while Jupiter's coming in, Mercury's coming out, and there's information that becomes obscured, and then we're just left with Jupiter pretty much there in the morning sky. So it's going to be very interesting. And I think especially that full moon in Virgo is going to be ruled by Mercury, who's applying to Jupiter. And I think they're also applying to Neptune during this time period too. So it just kind of adds this further layer of distortion, which is what I think Neptune tends to do.
Definitely.
So our chart that we picked out for the month is the Aries ingress. And this is interesting because it's pretty much everything we just kind of talked about in like these bullet points, but we picked up the Aries ingress because, again, that's when Jupiter does finally commit phases and is a morning star now. And we set the location for Washington, D.C., just because this is like the Aries ingress of like the country that is here. And it's very interesting how we do see that idea of misinformation or like gullibility being particularly relevant within the context of like the United States, because the ascendant, the rising sign for this is that Gemini rising, ruled by Mercury in Pisces, who is about to enter into the beams and is confronted with Jupiter. Yeah.
It's a very interesting chart that we're looking at here. And I think I misspoke earlier when I said that Mars was at 9 degrees. It's like 21, right? In the Sibley chart. Yeah. And so what's interesting about this chart is actually that the ascendant here would be conjoined the natal Mars. And so that's definitely going to be very interesting. And one thing we think about with Mars in Gemini is a dispute of knowledge. And so Mercury being about information and ruling Gemini is going to be about knowledge or information. And then Mars is going to show an argument or a dispute in that information. We see this
Yeah.
activity rising in kind of, the scene throughout this next year, especially then with Mercury being in Pisces. And so that's going to be very interesting, especially then when we look at something like the moon, which the moon can also have to do with information or how things are being passed around. And the moon here at 29 degrees of Libra is actually about to enter her fall. And so that's
Yeah.
a very important piece. It's going to characterize the entire year, because the Aries ingress can kind of serve as a chart of the year for any nation or person. And so we're actually seeing this kind of teeter-totter of the moon about to enter her fall. We see that the other planet that represents femininity and women's rights is going to be Venus, and she's also besieged here. And so unfortunately, there does seem to be a lot of tension and even affliction when it comes to women's issues, and that's something that is a little bit concerning for sure.
Yeah, the scales are going to tip once the moon enters Scorpio. And it's there with the South Node, which doesn't make me happy. And it makes me think, especially for this Aries ingress chart, that Mars is retrograding in the first house as well too. And so that, like, it's going to retrograde in the first house, but you're also dealing like with Venus's besiegement up there in the ninth house, which, can speak to like law or legal stuff. And I'm wondering if this is going to be like some sort of like law that is imposed that is like very restrictive and doesn't and honestly, I definitely think it's going to be us. We've seen it already come up with abortion issues for women in like Texas and other like states. It looks like there's something about health and like sex being relevant because the moon's in the fifth house, but then it's going to enter into the sixth house, so it does have a lot to deal with, like, with health related issues. And I think as a result of that, there's as a result of whatever tension is going on here, that it's going to cause people to come in and be like, look, this is the facts, this is the information. And Mars definitely has a much sharper and argumentative tongue when it comes into Gemini to kind of like break the disillusionment of like Jupiter.
Definitely. And we're going to definitely see Venus's cycle as she gets later eclipsed by the sun. That's going to be very important over in November. And so we see this whole story with Venus, especially, that's going to kind of track a lot of the women's rights issues. And especially seeing her besieged in this chart, it doesn't look very good.
It does not look like a promising omen. And by the way, it's actually the moon that eclipses Venus, not the sun, because I don't think the sun and Venus will be at the same latitude. But it's the moon and Venus that are at the same latitude.
During a solar eclipse.
Exactly.
Solar eclipse, but the moon is going to actually block out not only the sun, but also then the moon, Venus. It's
very interesting. So we run into like a lot of this Aquarian restriction. Saturn is reining it all in. And so Saturn is like giving a stop to Venus and Mars's like passion in a way too, or like a container. So I think we should move on to Q2 now. So Q2 is going to be from April through June. And when we move into April, our title is Roller Coaster, Riding the Wheel of Fortune. And Mercury is moving very fast during this time period now, because after, I think, did we get the Cazimi in? I think we get the Cazimi. We start the month with the Cazimi. But we start the month with Mercury in Aries, and it's going to end the month in Gemini, which means Mercury is going to be covering a lot of territory. We also get that Mars-Saturn conjunction, as we talked about earlier. It's going to be, we get a Venus-Saturn conjunction at the end of March. We get a Mars-Saturn conjunction at the beginning of April. We also get which is the malefics conjoining, both Mars and Saturn as malefics conjoin at the beginning of the month, and then we get Venus and Jupiter as benefics, who bring things towards moderation and support the flow of life. Conjoin at the end of the month. And then we also get the beginning of the eclipse season in Taurus and Scorpio, with an eclipse on the same day that Venus and Jupiter conjoin.
So we call this the Wheel of Fortune because we have these high highs and low lows again, which is a theme throughout the entire year, but especially in April. What's nice about this, though, is we see that the low starts off the month with Mars and Saturn, and then Venus and Jupiter is actually after that. And so it's almost like we start at this kind of like moment of tension and strife, but then we actually are lifted up out of it. And so there is hope when it comes to the month of April, even though it's going to be quite chaotic and varying amounts of fortune.
Yeah, things get worse before they get better.
Yeah. But they
Yeah,
get better after they get worse.
exactly. And when we look at April and just the month here, it is very busy. We start off the month on April 1st with a April Fool's new moon. And then we get a Cazimi with Mercury Cazimi right after as the exterior conjunction. So Mercury is not retrograde, but it's changing to become an evening star now. And then on Tuesday the 5th, we get the same day that Venus enters Pisces is the same day that Mars can join Saturn. And then on the 7th, we'll get Mercury sextiling Saturn. Mercury will then sextile Mars and witness their conjunction. Then we also get on the 10th, Mercury square Pluto. We get Mercury entering Taurus on the same day. And then from there, we get the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction, which is going to be taking place on April 12th. April 15th is when Mars will enter Pisces. The following day, we get a full moon in Libra. And then coming down from that, we get Mercury sextiling Venus, which is very cute. And then we get Mercury conjoining Uranus. And then on the 20th, the sun will enter Taurus. The 24th will be Mercury square Saturn. The 27th, it's going to be Mercury sextile Jupiter. And then Venus will conjoin Neptune. Then on the 29th, we get Mercury who enters Gemini, and then Pluto stations retrograde on the 29th. And then on the 30th, we get a solar eclipse in Taurus on the same day as a Venus-Jupiter conjunction.
Yeah. So there's quite a lot happening in April, and it deserves a lot more than we can actually talk about today.
Yeah.
But you do see that there's quite a lot of change, especially with Mercury's speed now, how much he's covering his aspects. We're also going to be seeing that huge shift with Venus, where we have Mars and Saturn conjunct, which is very combustive and not very conducive to the goals that we have happening in Aquarius, but then Venus is happening in Pisces. And so we have like this growth in one area of our life, remarkably, where we see Pisces falls in our charts. And we also have this kind of tearing down in another part of our lives, which is marked by the house that Aquarius occupies.
Yeah, there's a lot of like tearing down and like destruction in the Aquarius. And I think it's interesting because Mars is, traveling through Saturn, and that conjunction, when it conjoins Saturn at the beginning of the month, is literally at the exact bending of the nodes too.
Yeah.
So it's the bending of the nodes by then will be 22. The bending of the nodes, which will be square the north and south node, which are at Taurus and Scorpio, will be 22 Leo and 22 Aquarius. 22 Leo being the north bending, 22 Aquarius being the south bending. So Mars is really coming in to finish the job.
Yeah, definitely.
The chart we picked out for the month is the Mars-Saturn conjunction because it really does highlight the majority of what April looks like. Because even though things do get increasingly better as we move away from April, like the beginning of April, this is still the circumstance we find ourselves in at the beginning of the month. And I think it highlights a lot of things beautifully, such as like Venus is out of her besiegement. It's the Mars-Saturn conjunction. Mercury, the moon is waxing, and also Mercury has just conjoined the sun as well. And so there's a lot of I think a lot of what this is about as well too is as an overtone with just Jupiter and Pisces. It's the month of the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction. I'm personally really excited for the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in terms of cinema and movies, because I know that at least while Jupiter's in Pisces, I know Doctor Strange 2 is coming out. And I'm a Marvel fan. I'm my boyfriend has turned me into a Marvel fan. And so I have just been keeping up with it and everything. And Doctor Strange 2 is the title is Multiverse of Madness. And I think that idea of the multiverse being opened up and having that something that the MCU actually explores in in cinema is going to be like insane with the Jupiter and Neptune conjunction. But I also think one of the things that's very interesting, because Venus comes into Pisces with this Jupiter Neptune conjunction, is that one of the things that Pisces gets a rap for in like especially the ancient world is overindulgence, because it's the place of both benefics. And it's interesting because we're indulging in things that might not be real or might be distorted of like from the truth or from reality, because Neptune is what we're kind of indulging in here. And so I think there's definitely like, I think one of the themes that I don't like that I have been seeing increasingly get more like attention is like the metaverse, and like the idea of there being this like literal alternate reality that people can go into. It's very Jupiter Neptune, but I think the North Node in Taurus during this time period, we often feel very unsatisfied where the North Node is, because there's this idea of craving something or wanting something, but never feeling fulfilled or feeling that that desire can be attained. Even though there's an increase of it, there's also this dissatisfaction that comes in as well. And there's a dissatisfaction in materiality within that North Node in Taurus. And that Jupiter, Neptune, Jupiter, Pisces, Venus Pisces is like trying to find other mediums of indulgence without, while like trying to find other mediums of indulgence while realizing that there's a lot of structure in our world that is maybe too painful to deal with. And as a result, we're like, okay, let's just go somewhere else and just pretend like this doesn't exist. Like it's like the idea of like when like, I don't know if you've ever talked about it like with your friends or anyone else, but I'm pretty sure everyone has like this conversation. Maybe it's just a Saturnian thing for me, but I'm like, do you ever just want to like disappear into the woods and just like get away from society and everything? Well, there's your opportunity in April.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a really good point, especially when we look at the themes, the overarching themes of Saturn in Aquarius, because if we actually look at Saturn in Aquarius, we can find that the Saturn return of the internet is in Aquarius. And so this is like all in the background of this setting, is that we're actually understanding like, okay, what is it like to have a culture that is now completely online, especially with the lockdown? We're always on Zoom, we're always, on our phones. And then now we're introducing even more like the metaverse or what have you. And so, the overindulgent in even types of connections between people, where we look at the moisture of Jupiter, the moisture of Venus, the moisture of Pisces, all of them are coming together. And that can mean that we have a lot of social engagement and, understanding, but between people, we have a lot of communication, but that can also mean that we're going to be burnt out from too much. We have so much interaction with people, even if that's online, that can be too much for people to handle. We can have, phone addiction. We can have now addiction to, any type of media. And so the desire, the delight is definitely going to be there with Venus there, but we're also going to find that that could be too much to handle.
Yeah, especially because Venus will go into Aries next month.
Yeah.
Which I think is a good segue to go into next month. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, perfect. Let's go. We also have the Venus-Jupiter conjunction here that we have, because it is a little bit like, that's actually just what we talked about. So I don't think we have to review this slide. It's on the same day as an eclipse though, which is very notable. So there's like something that we are able to indulge in that does bring a lot of like incredible change. And it like ushers in something like new, like with that solar eclipse there. So yeah, let's go into May. So no, you can, no, you go. It's your turn. Sorry.
So we call this one stalemate, and this is because we actually have quite a lot of tension between a lot of the planetary configurations this month, but nothing that necessarily gets resolved. It feels like a very long month, one that doesn't really have like an end. And so we see that there's a continuation of eclipse season. So everyone's going to be feeling your regular eclipse season things. It's a little bit more of a chaotic time. It is a disruption from our regular lunation cycles. And so when we get used to basically breathing in and breathing out with the waning and waxing of the moon, when we look at something like the eclipses, that's going to be a disruption there. And that can, feel like hyperventilating or, not getting enough air. And so we have this extreme between too much and too little when it comes to eclipses. And then we also will have our Mercury retrograde. And so that just kind of adds another layer to it, where we were saying Mercury getting out of hand, being in an air sign, overthinking, overanalyzing, kind of hyperventilating with the eclipse. And luckily, this will start to stabilize as we move, into that Taurus space with Mercury retrograde. And it's going to start birthing something new. When we look at like Jupiter into Aries, this is all going to be something changing and developing, but it does feel like a very drawn out month.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, because, and I think it's interesting that the same day Mercury stations is the same day Jupiter ingresses. And so Mercury is like confused as fuck. And Mercury's like, what? Like, huh? Yeah. Like Mercury is like confused. And it definitely is like things start to heat up, especially around this month too, because when we look at our calendar, oh, how do I go back? Here we go. When we look at our calendar, we see that on the 2nd of the month, we have Venus entering Aries. So we already get one planet in a fire sign. We get Jupiter, who sextiles Pluto, which is interesting. We also get this Uranus conjoins the sun in a cazimi. We get our Mercury sextile Venus aspect on the 6th. Then on the 3rd, as I just, not 3rd, on the 10th, as I just described, Jupiter will enter Aries, Mercury will station retrograde. When we come into the 15th of the month, then that's when the sun is going to square Saturn. And then on the 16th, we get our lunar eclipse in Taurus. Then on the 18th, we'll get Mars conjoining Neptune. Then we also get on the 19th, Sun trine Pluto. And then Mercury retrograde will make a sextile to Jupiter. On the 20th of the month, the sun will enter Gemini. Following right after that, on the 21st, we'll have Mercury, who comes into a cazimi with the sun and conjoins the sun. Then on the 22nd, Mercury will quickly re-enter back into Taurus, find itself making a sextile to Mars. Then Mars on the next day will enter Aries. Right after, then on the 25th, Mercury will make a trine to Pluto. Then Venus will square Pluto on the 27th. After Venus's ingress through Aries, it'll then make its way into Taurus. Then we get Mars conjoining Jupiter on the 29th, and then we end the month with a new moon in Gemini on the 30th. And that'll be our first like kind of like lunation cycle where we won't have an eclipse in Gemini and Sag like fully now by this time period. So it's very interesting that we end the month with that new moon. And yeah, I mean, this month is very interesting because it's definitely it definitely heats things up, but it also brings us to like deal with a lot more serious topics during this time period too, especially with that lunar eclipse, because it's going to be very closely square Saturn. I mean, when we take a look at this, chart, I mean, we actually did pick the lunar eclipse as the chart to look at. There is a lot more idea of like pain or like depravity, or just like where you feel as if you've been undernourished or undertaken care of, or like malnourished or maltreated in a way, with the moon being in Scorpio, especially on top of the South Node, and where that falls in like the Scorpio part of your chart, but then also finding like this heaviness or potentially a reason for why there is this sort of depravity from where Saturn is in the chart as well too. And I think it's interesting that for a good majority of the month, Mars will be in Pisces, and while Mars is in Pisces, it'll be in a mutual reception to Jupiter, so they'll be in each other's signs. And it does make me think, especially with this lunation being ruled by Mars in Pisces, that there is a lot of confusion on what to do, what action to take in particular, or feeling like our sense of passion or drive is feeling distorted again because of that Neptunian influence that comes in. What are your thoughts on like May as a month?
May is definitely complicated because we have, the burnout from what we described with Jupiter and Venus in Pisces. We probably won't experience that while they're in Pisces, because that's just where we're indulging,
exactly.
That's where you do too much,
it's you haven't hit the point of no return yet.
You hit that point and you're not thinking about it in that moment because you're fully immersed. It's when Venus enters Aries that you're like, now I'm feeling hungover, now I'm depleted, now I'm like, why did I do that? We kind of wake up and feel whatever pains we inadvertently caused. Now,
Yeah.
on the other side of that, before we get all doom and gloom, Jupiter is very, very well placed here
Oh
because,
yeah.
Jupiter is in his triplicity, he's in his term, he's actually in his sect affiliation, both by phase and by sign. It's a brilliant Jupiter. We love
Yeah.
that Jupiter. It's great for elections, it's great for starting things, it's great for initiating things with that fire, with that passion, with that drive. It is, however, under the backdrop of some collective strife, because we do see that eclipse is going to be very tightly square within a
Mhm.
degree of Saturn. And so,
Yeah.
that's when all of the things that we've been mentioning with Saturn being at the bendings, being square the eclipses, that all reaches ahead. And we can then also find that Mars, when it comes and it does conjoin Jupiter, that's going to be like big fights, big arguments, or a blown out of proportion Mars. And Mars is going to be very strong, very capable of being argumentative and finding issue, finding the things we don't like. But, being as solution based probably is going to, be a little bit elusive.
The solution is separation.
Yeah.
The solution is independence, is what Mars says, is I'm gonna do whatever
Yeah.
the fuck I want to do.
Independent. Yeah.
And yeah, and I think it's very interesting that when Jupiter does enter Aries, it's not witnessing this eclipse, whereas it was
Yeah.
directly involved in that eclipse last time because Venus was conjoining Jupiter. But now Jupiter is expanding like a different area, and I think that whatever the Aries part of your chart is will receive like a lot of growth within these next few months, especially up until the 28th of July when Jupiter stations retrograde. But I love that Jupiter is in Aries. I'm personally excited for it for me because it's going into my 11th. So on top of all of these considerations of Jupiter being strengthened, it's gonna also be in the house where it rejoices in. So
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to that transit. I think one of the things that comes up, especially with Venus being in Aries, is that again, I don't want to say like it's an antisocial quality, but it is very antisocial. It's like I just want to be alone. Like don't disturb my peace. Like don't bother me. Like Venus finds delight in isolation during that time period. And Mercury is also like retrograde at the same time too. A lot of this makes me think of like relationship drama, honestly.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily about like it can be about romantic relationship, but it could also be about like politics, or it could be about like family drama, or like just the relationship between people's, like we indulge in something and things get a little bit messy, and we don't know where we went wrong, but we went wrong by just walking into the fog of Neptune. Like it's beautiful, it's nice, and it's dreamy, but there are consequences to the things that we indulge in, and that consequence can be overindulgence. And I think part of this year that it's very important, especially when we get into April and May, is that because Saturn is in such a like a period where it's being decreased, there might be an inclination to not want to deal with the Saturnian or not listen to the Saturnian principle of restriction or restraint. Yeah. But I think that it can actually be it can be like your best ally during this time period, is bringing like reining yourself in a lot more than you normally would, or setting proper limits and boundaries for yourself of what you can indulge. Like I think, like for example, not over drinking, not over smoking, not like doing those things while Venus is in Pisces with Jupiter because they feel fun and whatever. But then Saturn's like, look, like think of the effects, think of the long term. Like you see where the long term has gotten you already, where has gotten the state of the world now. Or is that the same thing that you want for yourself? And I think the other thing I thought was very interesting is that this is going to be the first time Jupiter can just kind of witness Saturn since their grand conjunction. And so it really does, and it'll be the first time Mars is going to witness Saturn since their conjunction as well too. So there's a lot of like strife that comes in, and the problem and the stalemate that comes in is when the exaltation lord of the sun and Jupiter being within the sun Jupiter of Mars and Jupiter being the sun enters Gemini, where Gemini's look there's two sides. It's a stalemate.
Yeah. And I like what you said about Jupiter witnessing Saturn, because we actually do have this rebirth that was started with the grand conjunction starting to actually take place, starting to grow, starting to lay a new foundation. When we talked about the decay of Saturn, the like wood rotting at the base,
Yeah.
we actually do see that there is new wood being placed, a new foundation being laid, and that starts with this witnessing between Jupiter and Saturn, which actually hasn't happened for a very long time. Because if we look at
Yeah.
Jupiter in Pisces, they can't witness. When we look at Jupiter in Aries or even in Capricorn, those 2 years, it was a conjunction. It was, they're trying to figure out what to do, but they weren't really implementing it. And so, even if we go as far back as Jupiter in Sagittarius, that was when Saturn was in Capricorn, they still couldn't
Yeah.
witness each other. And so this has been many years in the making, but it's finally going to start, coming together.
Yeah, Jupiter hasn't witnessed Saturn in aspect other than a conjunction since 2018 when Jupiter was in Scorpio.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting that was a Mars ruled sign, and now we're coming back to witness again in another Mars ruled sign. So, and I think it's really important because those effects, like, I mean, this grand conjunction that happened, like, it's something that we're playing out for the next 20 years.
Yeah.
But it's also like a new cycle playing out for the next 300 years too. And we get to see the beginning, like, it makes, like, the word that comes to mind with the Jupiter Saturn conjunctions is like a dynasty. Like, we see a new dynasty coming in the sense of like Jupiter coming to Aries, and Jupiter in Aries does talk about like royalty in a way, or like just the fire signs are seen as like the royal signs. And Jupiter comes to expand that in that regard. But the thing is that what I think is very interesting is that even though Jupiter and Aries witnesses Saturn and Aquarius, their sextile doesn't take place until both Saturn and Jupiter change signs again, when in 2023, when Saturn goes into Pisces and Jupiter goes into Taurus.
Yeah. So this is just kind of echoing or mirroring what will be happening in the future. And so, we can kind of pay attention to, while things are falling apart, what solutions are being proposed, because those, over the next few years are actually going to be implemented.
Yeah, there's a lot of like solution building, like how, like, I think of Aries, like one of the, especially in that first decan, like it's I know Austin Coppock labels it as like the axe in the sense of like, what are you like how do you cut your like or carve a path in this nature of life, and just like I think of the idea of the image that comes to mind with this in particular, with this decan of Aries, is when Sokka, in like when he's in the swamp in Avatar The Last Airbender, he's like cutting through the swamp, and Katara's like, Sokka, I don't think we should be doing that. And Sokka's like, no, I asked the swamp, don't worry, it said it's okay. And he's like being sarcastic as fuck. And so yeah, I thought that was just very interesting, because there's definitely something new that's being brought in. Like, it makes the imagery of Jupiter and Aries makes me think of that impulse where life becomes alive in the spring and everything opens up.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing too, when you look at like the medical overlap between planets, signs, and body parts, we look at Aries as being the head. And so Jupiter is very much like brainstorming in Aries. We have this kind of initiation, or this spark happening in our heads, where we're like, okay, well, what can we do about these issues? How can we fix these things? And, one thing is, when we talk about the malefic planets like Mars and Saturn, they are evil planets. They cause issues, but they also deal with things that are bad about life and how to fix them, especially when they're dignified. And so when we're looking at Saturn in Aquarius, we are talking about the exposure of a lot of these bad things, a lot of these, strife and struggles, but we're also looking at how to fix them, how to make them more conducive, how to actually work and operate within this area, which Mars in Aries, when he gets dignity with a benefic star like Jupiter, is definitely more about trying to fix the issues and strife that has come about.
Totally. I love that.
Should we move on to the next?
Yeah, we totally should. We chose the new moon, but I think we should, as another chart, but I think we should probably move on to June. Is this my turn or is this your turn?
I think it's your turn.
Okay, perfect. So our title for June is You Can Take a Horse to the River, You Cannot Make It Drink. And it's very interesting because June features Mercury stationing direct. While Mercury stations direct, Saturn will station retrograde. So we get that kind of like teeter totter at the beginning of the month. And then we get our first lunations in Gemini Sag in June, since the nodes have left those signs, which will feel a lot calmer. And I feel like there'll be a lot more clarity on information that comes in, even though we have Mars retrograde. After the confusion, we get disputes, I think is what it is. It's like, now that we're not confused and we can kind of see things concretely, now there's a dispute of what's right versus what's wrong. And I think that Jupiter and Aries has a lot to do with that at the same time too, because there's like some sort of leadership that comes in, but Jupiter is going to eventually be ruled by Mars, like in Gemini, and those lunations definitely highlight what has been going on during that time period. I know the full moon in Sag actually takes place on Donald Trump's birthday on June 14th. So we might see something that goes on with him in his chart. I can't think of anyone else. I think I know there's some stuff going on with Kamala because she has a Gemini rising as well too. Yeah. And I think also Joe Biden because he has a Sag rising. So it'll take place in like their first house. There's like a whole bunch of stuff going on with them. And then this is the Venus Saturn square off. Venus entered Taurus at the end of last month on the 28th. But then when we jump into June, we see that Venus is going to be in Taurus for the majority of that month, and then it'll eventually enter Gemini at the end. So we start off the month on June 3rd with Mercury stationing direct in Taurus. Then on Saturday the 4th, Saturn will station retrograde in Aquarius. When we move on to the 10th of the month, Mercury will trine Pluto for the final time, and then Venus will conjoin Uranus on the 11th. Then when we come to the 13th of the month, that's when Mercury will re-enter Gemini after its retrograde cycle. And then on the 14th, we get a full moon in Sagittarius. On the 16th, we get the Sun trine Saturn, which obviously comes in every time when Saturn stations retrograde. Then we get the Sun square Neptune. We also get on Saturday, Venus is going to be squaring Saturn, and they'll officially have their square off on the 18th. And then on the 20th, we have Mercury sextile Jupiter for the final time. We get the Cancer ingress on the 21st. Then on the 22nd, we get Venus entering Gemini. And then on the 27th, we get Mars witnessing Saturn through a sextile for the first time since their conjunction in April. Then on the 28th, we get a new moon in Cancer with Neptune stationing direct, Venus sextiling Jupiter, and the Sun squaring Jupiter all on the same day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is... Oh.
Yeah. I was just going to ask what your thoughts were. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, we see quite a lot, especially with Venus happening in this month. It's going to be also supported by Mercury. So there's a lot of like the media coverage of it, or what we're thinking about, what we're talking about. But we really see the key player is that Venus square to Saturn. And I think that's the next chart if you want to share that. Yeah. So here we have this. What's really interesting about this is that Venus and Saturn are both in their own homes. They're both sitting on their own thrones. These are like two kings going off to battle. These are heads of state, and they both have a lot of weight and a lot of authority. Now, usually when we look at an aspect, we can find the planet that was on the right or earlier in zodiacal order, because that planet is going to have risen earlier in the day. And so that planet is considered more dominant or overcoming the other planet. And so here, when we look at that square and we're trying to figure out who wins, which royal person actually gets to, have their armies win, we would normally say Saturn. However, what's interesting is Saturn recently just stationed retrograde, which debilitates him. And Venus has conjoined the North Node, which just amplifies her voice. It gives her a mic to speak on. And so what I find very interesting is that it's a very close call, but we actually might be able to give Venus the gold star, the winning trophy. And so that's notable because when we're looking at the issues with Taurus, when we're looking at the acquisition of goods, when we're talking about women's rights, all of these things are all very much keyed into the Taurus and the Venusian. And so we're actually saying that this moment might be a stand up to Saturn. It might be actually, putting the heat on Saturn and saying, look, we need change. We actually need you to implement something now. We need the goods to come. We need, jobs to be fixed. We need, people to actually have what they need, their needs met. Venus is all about the comforts of life and the necessities of life. And so I think this is a very important moment within that June space.
Yeah, June does bring a lot of tension between Saturn and Venus, and it's still that same story of 2021 of infrastructure, stability, nourishment, home living situation, all of these things in which we find rest or leisure in, especially with Venus, have some sort of challenge because Saturn is in that overcoming position. And Venus does get a lot of support from the North Node. I know in the Vedic tradition, Venus and the North Node are friends. So this is usually seen as a more positive aspect in the Vedic tradition. But Venus, Venus definitely gets amplified in Taurus. And it's very interesting because the background of this as well is also Mars and Aries too. So we get both Mars dignified, we get Venus dignified, we get Saturn dignified, and Jupiter, and we get Mercury dignified too. And we get a lot of the planets in their own dignity. And it does talk about like I think when a planet is in its dignity, the way I've usually seen it come up is that and I know it's also talked about a lot in ancient texts as well too, is that the planet does gain a lot of power, but it also gains a lot of responsibility too. And that there is, luckily, Jupiter is helping out Mars here with what it has to do, but Venus and Saturn doesn't get much help. Saturn just kind of is there alone, whereas Venus gets the help of the North Node. And in many ways, this definitely does talk about like one of the things that comes to mind is like people taking initiative to resource themselves or create like communities for themselves where they're able to not necessarily rely on infrastructure anymore and trying to find like ways to support themselves when the infrastructure we have is very unsustainable in a way.
Yeah, definitely. It's a lot of rebellion.
It does feel that way. It's definitely a flare up, like as the slides say, like Mars and Jupiter are flaring and igniting something up. But it's interesting because they don't actually witness what's happening with Venus.
Yeah. Do we want to move to the next month?
Yeah, let's move to July. Or actually Q3. Yeah, Q3 is going to take place from July to September of 2022.
So July, we've called it like Eye of the Tiger or King of the Jungle. And there's a very interesting thing that's happening between the sun and our friend Saturn. And so there's going to be a lot that's going to be happening in July that shows power changes, tensions between authority, responsibility, a lot of, who is the king of the jungle. And that's going to be, really, taking a front stage in July. We also have Mars. Sorry, what?
No, yeah, I was just gonna comment real quick that I didn't even intentionally choose, like when we were coming up with these names, we didn't even intentionally choose it, but it's actually the year of the tiger in like the Chinese astrology. So it's even crazier that like the king of the jungle is usually seen as lion, and then it's the year of the tiger where like it's usually seen as like a rival, I guess, to the lion. But yeah, I just wanted to add that real quick, that's just interesting.
Very interesting. I think there's a lot of coalition coming between like these things that have been happening in the background finally coming together, especially which this whole year is about. It's about the whole backdrop of 2020, 2021. Now, what is 2022 bringing together that's happened? And we see that Mars is applying towards Rahu and Uranus. And so this is Mars now in Taurus, which is going to be very different than Mars in Aries. And so that's going to be one of the most notable things of this tension, this, strife that's going to happen between Mars and Saturn. They're going to be able to see each other from a hard aspect. And that brings about a lot of the tension that's necessarily for change. If you think about how you have to, put pressure on something, you actually have to have it at a hard angle so that you can actually push an object. And so this is about pushing things forward, rebellion, pushing and initiating action. So a lot of the last month was, thinking about what needs to be initiated, starting that off, and then putting the heat is what July is all about. We do see, unfortunately, that the sun is going to be maltreated by the malefics, though. And so that kind of maltreatment is just going to be more of that pressure, but being pressure on authority, because the sun is seen as the center of the cosmos. It is our ordering principle. All other planets, they are obscured by the sun. And so the sun is this king, this authority figure. And the maltreatment of the sun shows that there's issues with authority, that they are having to be accountable for a lot of the things that have been going on. And so that's very notable in this month. Do you want to introduce the calendar?
Yeah, it's a very notable thing for the month that the sun is being maltreated, especially because I'm not sure, I don't think we get that like this month, but it's something that's building up throughout the entire month, where it's like the sun is like getting pretty maltreated. And yeah, so I mean, to kind of start off the month, we start off with Mars square Pluto, very explosive to start off the month. And then the next on the next day we get Mercury, who is making a square to Saturn, but also making a square to Neptune, but will also make a trine to Saturn. Then when we move on to the 5th of the month on Tuesday, on Mars's day, actually, Mars will enter Taurus, but Mercury will also enter Cancer, and they'll sextile each other on that same day too. So after they have like a dignity, both of them have a dignity change. And it's actually really funny because they're both moving out of their home signs, where Mars is moving away from Aries into Taurus, whereas Mercury is moving away from Gemini into Cancer. And now they come to some sort of like agreement on something where Mercury will square off with Jupiter on the 9th. The sun will sextile Uranus on the 10th. On the 13th of the month, we get a full moon in Capricorn. We also get Venus trine Saturn on the same day when Venus is in Gemini. We also get Venus squaring Neptune the day after. And then we get our first exterior conjunction in a water sign between Mercury and the sun on the 16th. Then on the 17th, we get Venus entering Cancer along with both Mercury and the sun trine Neptune. Mercury will oppose Pluto on the 18th. The sun will oppose Pluto on the 19th. Mercury will enter Leo and enter into this fixed cross activation between Mars and Taurus and Saturn and Aquarius on the 19th. Then the sun joins the party on July 22nd. July 23rd is when Mercury will trine Jupiter. And then on the 25th, we get Venus square Jupiter. And then the 26th, Mercury squares Mars. And so now there's some tension between Mars and Mercury. Then on the 28th, we get a new moon in Leo on top of Mercury square Uranus. That same day where we get a new moon, Jupiter will also station retrograde. And then on the 31st, we get Mercury opposing Saturn. And then the sun will trine Jupiter.
Yeah, there's quite a lot. And I think that one thing that we really honed in on was the appearance of Mercury, because it's going to be on Regulus and is actually going to be
is that in August? Oh, I think it's August. Yeah.
Oh, is it August? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Because it's 1 degree of Virgo. So this leads up to that. And so what we're actually looking at when we see the sun ingress into Leo and Mercury ingress into Leo is the opposition of Saturn and the square of Mars. That won't perfect until later, but it's the start of that maltreatment. So in the Hellenistic tradition, we actually have what classifies as one of the worst conditions a planet can be in, which is being opposed by a malefic or receiving a superior square from a malefic. And so this is actually going to be both. Both.
It is both.
And it's not perfect yet. It's not going to be by degree. That's going to be building, but it's when Mercury enters Leo and when the sun enters Leo that the heat is turned on, the water starts to boil. And so that's very notable. We do have a very benefic square between Venus and Jupiter, which is happening in completely different signs. The one thing that we actually are very happy about is opposite to maltreatment is bonification, where we have a planet that is going to be in a superior square, a benefic in a superior square to a planet or in a superior trine. Here we have Jupiter in a superior trine. Yeah. And so it's very interesting because we have 2 conditions of maltreatment and 1 condition of bonification. So both are going to be at play. We do see that there's going to be, again, this high, high, low, low. It's this varied fortune, varied fate. But we do see that there is an assistance that the sun will draw upon. That assistance is when we see that degree-based trine actually does happen in July. And then I think it's really in August where we see all of those factors start to take a turn down for the worse.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just there's an incredible amount of fixed energy in the chart, and there's going to be a lot of like tug of war that comes in where, Saturn is trying to hold its own against the sun. And Mars and Saturn's trying to hold its own against Saturn is trying to rein in or keep Mars and the sun in check. And then the sun's like, nope, not with me. I'm in my home sign. And then Mars is like, look, Mars is with Rahu. And I think with Mars and Rahu, there can definitely be there's I don't want to say explosiveness, but what's not shown in the chart is that Mars will also be with Uranus, so it is kind of explosive and very disruptive. What I think of July as is that July is setting up a lot of it's setting up everything for August, and that July is all of this tension that is building, and it's very slow. It's like slow cooked. This is like some slow cooked, like this is some slow cooked pernil that's falling right off the bone, right off the bone. And it's, in some ways with Mars in Taurus, I think there is another attack, like after Venus trying to bring some balance when Venus was in Taurus to, her home sign after there's been quite a bit of like activity that's happened since Venus was last in Taurus. The North Node wasn't last in Taurus last time. And now Venus is here. Like now the North Node's with Uranus, and now Mars is coming in to kind of, I don't want to say destroy what Venus has done, but it kind of does look like that because, Venus has tried to fix things, and now Mars is coming in to create some sort of division or create some sort of challenges, again, within these ideas of like materiality. Like I think 2022's theme is the stability of the current material world, really, and just the material things we indulge in. If these are things that are actually going to be like long lasting or give us stability, and Mars is maybe trying to fight for them and trying to fight for some things, but it's not I don't think Mars, it's really weird because I don't want to say Mars is going to win because Mars is with the North Node, but this thing that Mars is fighting for blows up out of proportion with the North Node, and there's just like Mars is very fixed in what it wants to get in Taurus, and Mars is, it's like creating a lot of disruption. And in some instances, I think of Mars and Taurus where Mars is in action. Mars and Taurus is not taking action as well too. And it's almost kind of like maybe like there's an instance where we're like dependent on like Mars for us to do something or take some sort of initiative or action, and Mars is just not budging, and Mars's idea of not budging is creating a lot of disruption because it's with Uranus.
Definitely. And I think one thing we can look at, as you were saying, with the material world, when we're looking at this longer backdrop, we're looking at this nodal story. And so the North Node is also called the head of the dragon. And I really think it's what we are consuming. And we see that we consumed a piece of cake with Venus there, but now we actually have this really spicy food that we might have bit too much of, and now our mouth is just burning. And so this July theme is that burning sensation in the mouth where it's like, why did I eat that?
It's spicy. And that's really interesting because Jupiter does go retrograde, and because things get too spicy, Jupiter's looking for more moisture in Pisces when it re-enters in October.
Yes, 1,000%. It's looking for something to quench that thirst and nullify that, spice.
Yeah, but I think it's also interesting because it's like typically when you eat spice, you don't drink water, you drink milk. Yeah, because it'll like, I don't know the science behind it, but I just know you drink milk. So it's going to be interesting to see what milk is being provided.
Yeah, definitely. And, we might only be left with water, but,
Exactly. Something's better than nothing.
Something's better than nothing.
So let's see. We go into August, which we've titled as Roasting Marshmallows. And this is when Mercury, like as Liam said before, this is when Mercury makes its appearance. This tension that has been building between Mars conjoining the North Node and Uranus and squaring Saturn, while that's all like building up, it actually climaxes in August, and we actually get the release of all of that aspect perfecting. Mars will also enter Gemini as well too, and once Mars enters Gemini in August, it's not leaving until the end of March in 2023. So the rest of the year now is Mars and Gemini. And as a side note, Mercury enters shadow during this time period too. So we go into just kind of looking at August and its transits. It's very interesting because that Mars-Uranus conjunction, North Node Uranus conjunction happens on the first of the month. And one of the things I was definitely like, we were researching before this that, when's the last time Uranus was on the nodes in
Mhm.
Taurus? In Taurus in particular was during World War II, like I think just before World War II. I think it was actually in the same year as like 39 or whatever. There was, and I'm not trying to say like there's going to be a world war starting, but there was this conflict of power that does happen, and we do see a very similar thing happening now. And this isn't something that's, this shouldn't be a surprise. I don't think it should be a surprise with the state of our world right now, but we really do see things come to like an explosive, like it really does look very explosive.
Mhm.
And like challenges within power and authority and control at the same time too. That's all
Yeah.
that's all Saturn and the sun deal with. And Mars is like who can take action, and who's
Yeah.
allowed to take action, who's allowed to exert their power, and feeling like restrained in that way. But it's
Which
interesting. Oh, sorry. Yeah,
thing
go.
about Uranus is like, if you even think about Uranus and how it was discovered, it really broke through that boundary with Saturn. And so
Yeah.
we thought that Saturn was it, that was the extent of anything that could be. And then when we discovered Uranus, it's like, oh my God, there's more. It's actually something that broadens our horizons. And when we talk about something like world war, when before we had world navigation, we didn't have the capacity for world war.
Mhm.
And when we talk about a worldwide pandemic, if we didn't have the interconnected world that we have today, we wouldn't have the capacity to have a worldwide pandemic. And so
Yeah.
what we're looking at when we're looking at Uranus is this expansion of our horizons to something that was not possible beforehand, where we're looking at more interconnectedness, but that also means that the whole system is taking on a lot more of a load.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
system takes on a lot of stress, and it's interesting because we get on the second of the month is Venus sextile Mars. And that,
Mhm.
which is interesting because Venus sextile Mars might be somewhat good for Mars just because Venus is the ruler, but at the same time, um, maybe it's not the best for Mars actually, because Venus is in Mars's fall by this time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, we definitely have that ongoing for August, in the background. Then we have on the 4th of the month, Mercury enters Virgo. Then on the 7th of the month, we get Venus trine Neptune. That's the same day that Mars squares Saturn. On the 9th, we get Venus opposite Pluto. Then on the 11th, we get a full moon in Aquarius on the same day the sun squares Uranus. That's also going to be the same day that Venus enters Leo.
Mm.
On the 14th of the month, we get the Sun Saturn opposition. We also get that as the same day that Mars trines Pluto. On the 16th of the month, Mercury will trine Uranus. Then on the 20th of the month, starting the Mars and Gemini trine for the end of the year, Mars will enter Gemini. And then Mercury will oppose Neptune on the following day, on the 21st. On the 22nd, we get Mercury then trining Pluto, and it'll also make the sun will also ingress into Virgo.
Mhm.
On the 25th, Mercury will enter Libra. On the 27th, we'll get a new moon in Virgo with Venus squared to Uranus. And then we'll also get that same day, the sun will square Mars as well, too. So we get the sun opposing Saturn, the sun square Mars. And then finally on the 28th, we'll get Venus opposing Saturn. So our chart that we picked out for this month was Mercury's appearance, because Mercury is going to be it will be visible by this time period, but it'll be visible on the fixed star Regulus, which does gain a lot of familiarity with like notoriety and sometimes fame, sometimes power. But at the same time, it's also the heart of the lion too. So there is Mercury being on the heart of the lion does talk about like some sort of, like we talked about, like trumpets being played,
Yeah.
or like some sort of alarm going off in a way.
Mm-hmm. Which, when we talk about the heart of the lion, and we talk about the lion being this king, and the heart is the most like intimate or core part of that kingliness. And so what we're actually looking at is like a real deep look at the authorities and what's currently going on in places like the White House, or in any type of establishment. We're actually like really seeing into it, especially because Mercury is making its appearance. So we can think about Mercury visiting the sun and kind of going obscure as like an interview with the king, and then it kind of being released. And so the idea is that we're getting new information about what's currently going on when it comes to these structures. And that's going to be a lot of news, especially after everything kind of happened earlier in the month and in July. We're seeing that there's more information coming out and then more happens, and so it's this halfway point between all of this activity that we actually get a little bit more of a closer look.
Totally. And the month does take on a serious tone because we get our lunation, our full moon of the month, like pretty much right on Saturn too. So there's it's an Aquarius full moon that takes place right on Saturn, and Saturn is very, tense. Saturn is very serious. It's something that does highlight like alienation or restriction, or it's not necessarily a good call. It's a culmination of something that we are like, okay, here's a problem we actually have to deal with now, and that we actually have to like this is not some news that wants to be released, but it has to be, and it has to be done very loudly.
Yeah, definitely. And this is why we kind of called it roasting marshmallows, not because it's a fun kind of get together, but more of we are having to sit over the fires and just make the best out of the situation. And when we see Mercury make that appearance, it's that alarm being, sounded. We're seeing okay, all of this is about to ensue. Mars is about to go into Gemini. Mars is about to square Saturn. All of this tension is building up, and we're kind of all getting the alarm.
Totally. Yeah. And then Mars goes into Gemini at the end of the month, and we've kind of already been talking about that throughout the forecast, but now we actually get that coming up in August. Yeah. So before we move into September, should we just take a quick break?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to pause the recording.
Awesome. So for the month of September, we've titled it Clean Up Your Mess. And this is because we're really looking at Venus again. The key planet of the month is again Venus. We have her as such a staple this month. What we see her doing here is she's actually going to set under the beams of the sun. And so this is another phase change that she'll be going through. When Venus goes under the beams of the sun, we actually have to kind of diminish our Venusian luxuries, our, pretty makeup or bed sheets or what have you, and actually do the laundry. And so this month, when Venus goes under the beams, is actually something where we actually have to clean up the mess that is kind of accumulated. We have to restore Venusian things by getting a little bit uncomfortable. And this is definitely going to be exacerbated by the fact that as Venus sets under the beams, she's actually going to be squared by a superior square from Mars. And so that's going to show this tension that needs a breaking point. It's where you are in a really messy room and you have to clean it because you're now living in filth. And so this is a really big moment where Venus is now saying, okay, we've been doing what we've been doing, but it's not working. We need to redirect.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that Venus is such a star of the show for the month, because Venus in Virgo is really about it's not Virgo is about cleaning up and getting into the bacteria and the dirty stuff that needs to be
minutia.
Yeah, exactly. And Venus is this is not the environment I want to be in. This is not pleasant for me. But Venus setting under the beams is very interesting, because that was something that we talked about as our theme for September. But before we get into that, just briefly, on the first of the month we get Mars, who sextiles Jupiter. On the second of the month we get Mercury opposite Jupiter, which is going to be another theme in the background of the month too. We also get Venus entering Virgo officially on the 5th of the month. On the 9th is when Mercury will station retrograde. The 10th of the month is when we get a new full moon in Pisces. On the 11th, we get the sun trine Uranus. On the 16th is when Mars will officially, Maltree and square Venus. And then on the 16th, that's the same day that we get Neptune the sun opposing Neptune. The 18th, we get the sun trine Pluto. On that same day, we also get Mercury retrograde opposing Jupiter in Aries. We also get on the 20th of the month, Venus trine Uranus. Then on the 22nd, we get the Libra ingress. On the 23rd, we get a cazimi between the Sun and Mercury. And then Mercury will go back into Virgo on the same day. On the 24th, Venus will oppose Neptune. The 25th, we get a new moon in Libra. On the 26th, we get Venus conjoined to Mercury in Virgo. And then we also get Venus trine Pluto. The Sun will oppose Jupiter, and Jupiter will be in its halfway point through its cycle. Mm-hmm. And then through its retrograde cycle, Mercury will then trine Pluto on the 27th. On the 28th is the first out of 3 Mars Saturn trines. And then we end the month with Venus entering Libra.
Yeah, which we get 3 Mercury opposed Jupiters. There's 2 of them in September. And so there is that, I think we called it like picking sides between a mercurial approach to knowledge versus a Jupiter approach to knowledge, both of which are on different sides of the spectrum. You know, we can also see this as like the minutia versus the large picture. We can talk about this like science versus like religious beliefs. We can talk about a lot about like that picking sides and that tension between different types of information.
Totally. And I think it's definitely going to be a lot about like identity and power at the same time too, because it's so like Jupiter in Aries is like it's like the figurehead, the person here who's going to lead people and take initiative and take charge. And then Mercury is like, okay, you got the facts to back that up. Like, do you what's your opposing side? Like Mercury is the opposing side, and Mercury is kind of acting as an agent for Venus in a way.
Yeah,
because Mercury's in Venus's sign, but then it's interesting because Venus is in Mercury's sign as well too. So they have this like mutual reception, but it doesn't look like Venus benefits from this. I mean, I guess they're both in each other's signs, but Venus doesn't benefit from being in Virgo. And Mercury, I guess Mercury benefits in Libra because it's in its triplicity. But I think a lot of September is this same sort of like revision or change, again, to knowledge and information. And I think a lot of it does come in the idea of like agreement as well too, where we don't like there's a lot of disagreement on what we find to be true. What is the truth? There's a lot of dispute over that, but it takes a much more like, it's not because we're debating the actual truth, it's because we're debating identity and who is symbolic of this truth that we like, you know, place some sort of importance or like value onto. And so I don't know, like Venus, that Venus Mars square, it does look like it does look like Mars is it's very debatey, like it's very like how do we say, I think this is also like kind of gearing up for like the elections in 2022 as well, and it is an election year, which is even crazier, at least in the US, but it is very debatey. It's about like, it makes me think of like attacking other people's like character or like slandering other people's like appearance or like the way they look, or being like the like how like they presented things as kind of like messy. And then Venus is like, okay, maybe it might like Venus, like there might be something that's like being tried that is trying to be covered up as a result of Mars showing this opposition point of being like, look, well, you know, what about this? What about that? Like Mars is like always having all the answers and all the questions all in one. And it's definitely a very sharp tongue. It's a very critical feeling that we find in September this year.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with articulation and how things are articulated. And I think that brings us to October, where we see kind of like the consequences really play out.
Yeah, totally. So October is very interesting because it is kind of like a continuation of September, where there's a lot of stuff building up in September that also kind of like climaxes in October. And I think if there is one month in the year that is probably the most important, I would totally say it's October.
Yeah.
I don't know if you would agree with that statement.
I would definitely agree.
Okay.
October, November. But
yeah, October, November. Yeah, and it's because in October, like the title we called it is having to testify, because it's very Mercury, Jupiter. You know, will you tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Is there justice? Are things equal? Where is power out of balance? And how does Mercury, you know, regulate that? But Mercury is also being reined inward as well too. But in the month, we get Mercury stationing direct in October. We also get Venus officially conjoining the Sun in October, where she'll start to change phases and move towards an evening star, where she'll only be visible in the evening sky. And Saturn will also station direct. So we get Mercury and Saturn both stationing. We get our third eclipse of the year as a solar eclipse in Scorpio. Jupiter will re-enter into Pisces, searching for more truth, searching for more meaning, looking to moisturize and get out of this dryness and fricative state. And then Mars will station retrograde at the end of the month. And when this translates over into the calendar, we see on the first of the month, it's Venus opposite Jupiter when Venus is in Libra. The second of the month is when Mercury will station direct in Virgo. On the 6th is when Mercury will trine Pluto. And then on the 8th is when Pluto will station direct. On the 9th, we get a full moon in Aries. On the 10th, Mercury will re-enter into Libra. On the 11th, the sun will trine Saturn. And then on the, I'm pretty sure I forgot to put it up here, but it's on the 3rd, Saturn stations direct. On the 12th of the month, Mercury opposes Jupiter for the final time. Mars will square Neptune for the first out of 3 times. And then on the 14th, we get Venus trine Saturn in Libra and Aquarius. Then the sun trines Mars. Then Venus trines Mars on the 17th and 18th. Then the sun squares Pluto on the 19th. Venus squares Pluto on the 20th. On the 22nd is when Mercury trines Saturn. It's the same day that Venus enters in the heart of the sun. The following day after being in Libra, conjoining at 28, 29 degrees of Libra, both the sun and Venus enter Scorpio on the 23rd. Then on the 25th, we get a solar eclipse in Scorpio. On the 26th, it's going to be Mercury trine Mars. On the 27th, it's Mercury square Pluto. Then on the 28th, Jupiter will re-enter back into Pisces. And then on the 30th of the month, we'll have Mars stationing retrograde in Gemini.
Yeah, it's a pretty important month, to say the least. And I think that,
Totally.
We'll definitely have to go more in depth in the future that we can't do today. But when we're looking at the movement of Venus, this is when everything really piles up together, because after her Cazimi, she enters the sign of her detriment, and then she's conjoined the south node, and there's an eclipse that obscures her. And so this is when everything gets doubled down, where the whole narrative of Venus, the square to Saturn, the square to Mars, entering the beams, then she's finally like conjoined the sun. It's the last moment, and she enters her detriment and then is eclipsed. And so there's a lot that really gets piled on to October just with Venus alone. And then when we add in things like Jupiter entering Pisces, that just shows that we're really searching for the quench of our thirst.
Yeah, I think October is a very water heavy month, and it's very contrasting to the summer, because the summer was very hot with Jupiter in Aries, Sun in Leo, Mercury in Leo, Venus in Leo, and now it's getting very emotional, and it's getting very watery, and there's a desire to bring things together, but also realizing that, like, I think of Venus, or even just like an eclipse in Scorpio is like some sort of poison, or some sort of like malevolent water in a way. And looking to, like, it makes me think of stuff that's going on like with the water supply in the United States, in like some areas, and then even just around the world, and that like seeking better quality water, especially with the South Node in it's especially with the South Node in the water sign, seeking to purify water and purify toxins out of water. And then we really get to understand a lot of that, like that comes to like a climax in October. But it's interesting because this eclipse, like we said, it like obscures Venus, but like it'll literally obscure Venus in the sky, because both the sun and the moon will be at not the sun and the moon. Well, yes, the sun and the moon, but the sun and, well, not the sun. What's the word? The moon and Venus will be at the same latitude, and the moon will pass over Venus and it'll pass over the sun. And I think the idea of Scorpio just being relevant, it does talk about decay. It talks about ending. It's that fixed water. So it also does make me think of like emotional pain and trauma that is like very deep seated at the same time too. And having to really work through a lot of like the pain, or like ways in which we have been harmed, or when there's been sort of like a maltreatment or a malnourishment to the things that we love, and having to work through that and also purify that, but then release that at the same time with the South Node is there. And with Jupiter entering Pisces, it makes me think a lot about trying to find meaning or faith again too, as in a way of like, how do we restore faith after, in a way, maybe it's been burnt up, or
Yeah.
maybe it's been dried out way too much. And
Yeah.
Saturn stationing direct at the end of the month does bring a little bit of stability, but it's still very close to the bendings of the nodes. So it's still the same story, but Saturn now has a little bit more support to add more like infrastructure. But it is going to, and it's interesting because a lot of this Mars retrograde that opens up in November is Mars trine Saturn. Like Mars and Saturn are trying to work together, or Saturn's trying to get Mars to work with him. But there is a little bit of changes that Mars needs to go through as Saturn comes to station direct.
Yeah, I think about this whole flux from fire to water as thinking about like mudslides, where if you have a lot of fires in the middle of summer and they like burn down the trees and the plants, then you actually become very susceptible to landslides, where the rain will just hit the earth and it all erodes away. And so I think what we're seeing is that after the heat and the tension of the fiery summer, where a lot of the systems kind of get destroyed, we're looking at then the ramifications, and there's a lot of moisture and it kind of wipes the slate clean.
Yeah, it really does wipe the slate clean, and it's Jupiter is here to bring the water back in. And I think that's so interesting that in 2021 it dipped into Pisces for a little bit, and then it's taking another dip into Pisces again before it leaves. And then it'll be interesting because when Jupiter comes back into Aries for next year in 2023, it won't go back. It won't do the same thing that it did in Pisces, where it'll go back into Aries. It'll just be straight Jupiter in Aries, straight Jupiter in Taurus.
Yeah.
So it is like a mudslide, or I like that analogy as well too, because it's really true. Like all of the, like it's the water is just carrying all of this like ash down into wherever, wherever the river will take us. And it does look like being like maybe lost in a current sometimes as well too. And especially because we get like all this stuff squaring Saturn too. I really have been noticing, especially with the moon in Scorpio, that the Scorpio Aquarius axis does feel like this idea of like rejection and like pain. Like it's painful. Like it's pain that is dealt with in isolation sometimes, or pain that comes as a result of being isolated. And there's a lot to process, and there's a lot that becomes illuminated during this time.
Yeah, definitely. Should we look at November?
Yes, let's go to November.
November, we called it it's the thought that counts, which sounds a little bit pathetic, and it is. The reason is because we actually have this Venus-Mercury conjunction that we were really looking at, where they're both in Sagittarius. And what's interesting is Venus will be becoming visible, but Mercury won't be becoming visible. And so it's like 50% of our effort is going to really land. And so the thought really does count. And we will see that we're trying to rebuild the structures in a new way, in our own independent way, that is not going to be as susceptible to the landslides or the fires that we've endured. But we're going to see that it doesn't always take hold. And so, as we put more effort than actually is condensed into reality, that's okay. Like that's natural. And that's kind of the process of getting something started. And so this is like that month where we're trying to get the ball rolling, especially with Jupiter stationing direct. We're really trying to get things back into this flow.
Yeah, definitely. It is a little bit, I don't want to say a calmer month, but it definitely does try to like reintegrate back into like you said, like a flow, because it's really all of like Jupiter is stationing direct. It's something that's building up until really like the end of the month. But we also get a lot of Sag energy coming in too. It becomes very mutable, and we get Venus in Sag, Mercury in Sag, Sun in Sag, and it's very interesting because I think a big theme of November is conflict of information, specifically with all the Sag stuff coming in. And it's interesting because Mercury is going to be the ruler of the Mars retrograde, and so Mercury coming into the sign of its detriment is going to mean some important things for the Mars retrograde, in terms of like, realizing like something, like maybe something being blurted out that you didn't mean to say, but it actually has some sort of truth. Or maybe it's almost kind of like, how every little bit of joke has a little truth to it. It's almost kind of like that Mercury, Gemini, and Sag, like Mercury sort of thing going on here. But on the 5th of the month, we get Venus opposing Uranus. Then we get on the 7th, Venus squaring Saturn. We get a lunar eclipse on November 18th, and it's actually the same day that we get our exterior conjunction of Mercury and the sun. And so the same day Mercury conjoins the sun is the same day that there's this lunar eclipse happening. And so Mercury is really bringing a lot of unexpected news, especially because on that same day, Mercury is opposing Uranus. There's a lot of disruptive news and disruptive revelations that come about. On the 9th, we get the sun opposing Uranus. Then we get on the 10th, Mercury square Saturn, which brings a heaviness to what we're talking about in the news that we have to share. Also very investigative with Mercury and Scorpio. But then we get Venus trine Neptune. On the 11th of the month, we get the sun square Saturn. On the 14th, we get the sun trine Neptune. On the 15th, it's really nice because we actually get the benefics trine each other. We get Venus and Scorpio trine Jupiter and Pisces, which is something that we didn't get around this time around this year because Jupiter was in Aquarius during Scorpio season, but now when Venus was in Scorpio, but now Venus is going to be in Scorpio, and so will Jupiter, and so they'll have a trine, which I think it will be definitely very nice. It looks like cathartic release in my opinion. And then on the 16th, we get Mercury trine Jupiter. The same day, Venus will enter Sagittarius. The following day on the 17th, Mercury will enter Sag. Then Mars will square Neptune on the 19th for the second time. Then the Sun will trine Jupiter on the 20th. On the 21st, we get Mercury conjoining Venus. On the 22nd, we get the Sun entering Sagittarius. And then we get ready for a Sagittarius new moon on the 23rd. On that same day, we get Jupiter stationing direct at 28 degrees of Pisces. And then on the 28th, we get our second trine to Saturn from Mars. And on the 29th, we get Mercury making a sextile to Saturn, but also making an opposition to Mars too. And that's how we end the month.
Yeah, there's quite a lot, which, one thing I always kind of look at when I'm looking at like Uranus is I don't usually use the outer planets or the modern planets in my practice. But one thing that's really interesting about Uranus is it becomes visible when it had the solar opposition. And so we see right after this eclipse, there's going to be the appearance of this kind of like ominous planet that's not normally there. That definitely can show a lot of that unsettling news, or something like, this is breaking the structure that we thought there was, or this is a new spin on the story that I thought it was a certain narrative and is actually different.
And the thing that's happening in the background, even in October, is Saturn square Uranus, because they come within the same degree, I think, in October, and then it's still something that's carried into November.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's really like, Saturn square, it's the same story as 2022. It's infrastructure problems. And it's and I think another undertone we see, at least in the US for this, is it's the Pluto return of the US as well throughout the entire year. So it's definitely a whole reevaluation of power and money as well too, because it's in the US, it's in the Sibley chart's second house. So I think it's really interesting how we do see a lot of this tension come in, and especially Uranus becomes visible, but then the moon also. I'm wondering if Uranus will even be visible. I mean, Uranus might not be at the same latitude, so it might very well be visible.
Yeah, and visibility will definitely vary. But the only time that it can be visible is that opposition, which is then kind of keyed into that symbolic moment for sure.
Exactly. So let's see. Our chart we picked was definitely this Cazimi lunar eclipse happening. I think we just talked about this, so do we need to spend any more time on it?
No, I don't think we do. I think it is worth mentioning that despite not displaying Uranus in this chart, Uranus should be, isn't it like completely conjunct that moon? Or
Uranus is, it's if it's not conjunct it, the moon probably just passed it, because the solar opposition happens the next day. So we don't have to describe too much more about this, because we're just going over like an overview over the year, because we're eventually going to be going into detail of everything once we have more context with how all the astro weathers played out throughout the year. But we also have the chart of the Mercury Venus conjunction too, where Mercury is the ruler of Mars, and this opposition really is a halfway point, but this is something that really goes more so into December, and I think we should probably talk about December then, because the chart we have does display Mercury and Venus a lot more. But this is kind of cute. I don't know, I like Mercury and Venus here.
Me too. It looks like an opportunity. It doesn't look like we're gonna have a full integration of everything we want or we hope for, but at least we're getting our ideas onto paper, I think.
Totally. And I think it's interesting too how one of the things I didn't mention in October is that when and really in November when Jupiter comes back into Pisces, it's the same Jupiter Mars square again that took place in the beginning of the year, except
Yeah.
Mars is on the Mars is not overcoming Jupiter this time.
Which that's nicer because Jupiter will
Yeah.
have the superior position, which is cool.
Exactly. And Jupiter has a superior position, and it's it's also not Mars on the south node.
Yeah.
It's also not Mars on the south node. Yeah.
So
So I like that. So let's get into December, the last month of the year. Um, so it looks like this one is titled A Bird in a Cage. And this takes place on the full moon Mars opposition. And it's also going to feature a new moon square Jupiter. Jupiter will re enter Aries, and then Mercury will enter Shadow and station retrograde at the end of the month. So December, our last month of the year, features on the 1st, we get Venus opposing Mars. We also get Venus making a sextile to Saturn on the 1st of the month. We also get Mercury square Neptune, and then Neptune will station direct on the 3rd. And then on the 4th, we get Venus square Neptune. And then on the 6th, that's Mercury square Jupiter. Right after Mercury will enter Capricorn. Then we'll be left with the full moon in Gemini conjoined to Mars, conjoined to the Mars retrograde. They probably will take place, at least in my time zone, on different days, but they'll be within 24 hours of each other, where the Mars opposition falls on the next day, on the 8th. And then on the 9th, we get Venus square Jupiter. Then we also get Venus re-entering back into Capricorn. And then on the 12th, we get the Sun sextile Saturn. We also get the Sun on the 14th square Neptune. On the 17th, we get Mercury trine Uranus. And then on the 20th, Jupiter will re-enter back into Aries. The following day after, the Sun will will go into Capricorn. On the 22nd, we get Venus trine Uranus. The Sun will square Jupiter. And then we get a new moon in Capricorn on the 23rd. And then to finally end the month, we get Venus, Mercury conjoining Venus, or actually Venus conjoining Mercury, because Venus will be applying to a pretty stationed Mercury. And then Mercury will station retrograde in Capricorn on the 29th of the month. So this month is very interesting because it's the full moon on the opposition of Mars and the Sun. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's the real staple to this month, as well as Jupiter entering Aries, which is quite at the end. But what we're really looking at here is this kind of full culmination of that Mars narrative, because Mars has been retrograde and it's been wreaking havoc. But the real key moment in that is probably going to be this lunation that's going to activate that potentiality. And so what we see here with everything that we've talked about with Mars in Gemini, that's going to really become the focus, and it's going to be more so applied to lunar topics. And so what's really interesting about the sun and the moon, especially on a mundane level, is we can think of the sun as authority and the moon as like the people. And so what's interesting here is we've seen the sun maltreated a lot. We've seen a lot of issues with the sun. And here now we're seeing that this Mars is now being applied to the moon and the people. And so this kind of sets out a new space, which will definitely echo in 2023. But what we're looking at is the people really now having to deal with and integrate that Mars quality into their lives. And that can look like a lot of different things. We kind of named a bird in a cage because we're now feeling the personalized effects of that Mars in Gemini and saying things wrong, the ramifications of that. We're seeing, the whole slew of things that have evolved over 2022 are now becoming fully personalized and set into stone for the rest of like our lives. It's kind of like where we reflect on history and we reflect on the effects of 2020, 2021. Now we're kind of coming to the reflection of 2022, but it's becoming a lot more personalized in the way that we conduct our everyday life. Because the moon is a planet that changes so frequently and is so fast, it becomes very daily, routine, personal, and developed within our own lives. I think what's interesting about this lunation too is that it's almost perfectly trine to Mars. It's actually going to be the moon will be applying to Mars. Sorry, when I say Mars, I meant Saturn.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that trine is it kind of locks it into place as a more long-term event that we're
Mhm.
looking at. What are your thoughts?
I think that I think of Mars retrograde in Gemini as fighting within, like, I don't want to say siblings, but people who are like neighbors or people who are in close proximity. And
Yeah.
that there's like, because it's the moon with Mars, is that the people are fighting each other because it's in Gemini.
Yeah.
And in many ways, we might find ourselves being like polarized or in a position where we're like having to pick sides or choose sides. And it's really a battle of, again, of information. And I think especially with both the sun and Jupiter coming into cardinal signs and making a really important square off, there is a lot of like, it's like information and authority are, oh my god, how do I want to say this? It's like information is what causes like a lot of tension to eventually be released at the end of the month when the sun does square Jupiter, when they both re-enter into the like cardinal signs, and especially on the winter solstice. And then having this full moon just be pretty much that release point throughout that time period. It does look like a period where we, oh my god, it just looks very climactic. And I think that, I don't know, I don't like it.
Yeah, I honestly think this is
Yeah.
one of the most contentious, especially
Yeah.
because if you look at like what you said, if we look at a lot of dystopian kind of novels, we see that a lot of the integration of that corrupt political power is really what happens amongst people to themselves. And so I think that the fight amongst people and feeling unsafe in our own interactions with people is probably going to be most heightened at the end of the year. And so it's that fear. I think that Mars can definitely speak to just fear, whether that's mental, especially mentally, right? When in an air sign. And so even just the fear of interaction with people, that can be, even more dangerous forms of coronavirus that are going to be, probably coming out, where it's even more heightened fear amongst, interactions with our neighbors. And so that can be taking place in a lot of different ways.
Totally. And we get a resurgence of fire that comes in as well. It's a very fiery month. It really is. We get a lot of that Sag stuff. We get Mars heating shit up. And then we also get Jupiter re-entering a fire sign. And it'll be very interesting too, because this is also the final, like, these are the final months of Saturn in Aquarius too.
Yeah, exactly. And then we have a very different narrative as Saturn moves into Pisces.
Yeah, it's a completely different story.
Completely.
And it looks like that brings us pretty much to the end of the year. And I put your little profile here so people know where to contact you.
Well, thank you.
And do you have like any just, I guess, final thoughts or like comments or anything about, I guess, 2022 as a whole?
I think 2022 is definitely an important year. And I think that, like what we were saying with Saturn, when we segment off time, that is what we're really doing with astrology. It's a calendrical system that ascribes quality to spans of time. And so we can basically look at 2.5-year segments of Saturn in each sign, and we can narrow that down to 1-year segments with Jupiter in each sign, and then down and down and down. And what we're really looking at is the end of Saturn in Aquarius as we are moving into the 2023 space. And so this is the real pinnacle of what does it mean to have Saturn in Aquarius. And then, we can narrow that down into, now, what does that mean with Jupiter in Pisces? And Jupiter in Pisces is transitioning into the next chapter, which is Jupiter in Aries. And so we see that there's this, channeling down between one span of time within another, and we're kind of just coming to understand what does it mean to have Saturn in Aquarius.
Yeah, it's that final year. I think those are some of my thoughts for the end of the year too. And I think it's another thing that it's also the final year of is it's one of the final years of Pluto in Capricorn.
Yeah.
Because next March is going to be crazy. It's Saturn changes signs, Mars leaves shadow, Mars changes signs after the retrograde that took place at the end of this year. And then Pluto enters like 0 Aquarius. And I think that's going to be very interesting in how that plays out with COVID, because the first Mars Saturn conjunction at the beginning of the pandemic with the lockdowns was at 0 Aquarius. Then the vaccines came in with the grand conjunction at 0 Aquarius, and now Pluto's coming to 0 Aquarius, where it'll just only get to 0 Aquarius. And I'm honestly really kind of at a loss for words what that might signify and what that might bring in. But we definitely go from Pluto highlighting the archaicness of structure in Capricorn, and because Capricorn's kind of old things, and then it highlights, okay, how do we like move away from that and transition into the unknown, or just like decentralization in a way. And it kind of like Pluto will then be kind of just rapidly changing everything that Saturn has kind of either stripped away or reinforced.
I think that bringing attention to that sensitive degree of 0 degrees Aquarius is very important, especially when we realize that it's really close to a fixed star. And that fixed star, Altair, its symbol is basically an eagle. And so if we're looking at something like the United States, which is literally symbolized by an eagle, I think we can start to understand when, we segment off time, we've segmented off by different conjunctions, but we can also segment off time with like Pluto. And so we're looking at these huge cycles ending and beginning right on this star that's very symbolic, at least in my opinion, to the United States and its life and body, especially when we're talking about a Pluto return, which is really happening this year. And then moving forward, we're looking at the transition into new chapters that have been developed. And so this is really breaking down and decaying into a new chapter. And what that new chapter is, we'll have to explore in the future, but it's definitely a lot to look at.
Yeah, I'm really excited because we're going to be doing like monthly forecasts of like each of the months. And then so we'll go, whatever we didn't cover in this forecast, we'll go into much more detail, but we just wanted to kind of give an outline of the year ahead. And I think that as we go into each details, we see like what's happening in the news, as we just go about our day to day, we'll hopefully have some like reflections and see, if we were right about certain things, if we were wrong. And I don't know. Yeah, it's going to be a very dynamic year, and in the way it's the end of many things, and it's the beginning of a lot of new things.
Definitely.
So yeah, well, people can find you on your socials, which are like Twitter, Instagram, at like Liam Sofias, and then your website's liamsofias.com, right?
Yep, that's exactly it. And I do offer consultations just like you, and so you can find me there.
Perfect. Well, we are officially at the end. Well, thank you all for joining in and watching this forecast. And again, we'll be back every month to kind of update you on the transits for the month ahead. So thank you everybody for watching, and we'll catch you next time. Take care.
Bye.